There is a city beneath Stirling. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech about layers of history. A city. A structured, built, sealed place that sits under the streets and closes and closes and closes downward. And the people who have gotten close enough to know what it contains have, at each stage and in each era, arrived at the same decision about what to do with the information. The decision they keep arriving at is the same one. Seal it. Note the position. Walk away. And this has been happening in Stirling for longer than the castle, on the volcanic rock has been a castle, and for longer than anyone with formal authority over the ground has been in a position to make decisions about it. If you are sitting somewhere quiet right now, and the day is winding down, and you are looking for something to fill the hours with, this is the story of what is under a city that most people think they understand, and what the people who got close enough to see it decided to do when they got there. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Stirling sits on a volcanic plug. This is the geological fact that most people know, if they know anything about the geology of the place. The castle is on a crag of hard basalt that was pushed up through the surrounding rock by volcanic activity long ago, and then, as the softer material around it was ground down by ice and water over subsequent ages, the hard volcanic core was left standing. This is the same process that produced Castle Rock in Edinburgh and Dumbarton Rock and several other prominent landscape features across the central belt of Scotland. They are remnant volcanic plugs, the cores of ancient volcanoes from which everything else has been eroded, standing as islands of hard rock in a landscape that the glaciers of the last ice age reshaped into the relatively flat ground of the Forth Valley. The basalt of the Stirling Crag is very old in a way that the human presence on top of it is not. The basalt was formed during a period of geological activity that predates the existence of the North Atlantic Ocean, which makes it older than the continent of North America in its current form, and older by a great margin than any human activity anywhere on Earth. But the important geological fact for this story is not the age of the basalt, it is what happens beneath it. Below the basalt of the volcanic plug, in the geological sequence that lies under the crag and extends downward through the material that the erupting volcano displaced when it pushed its way to the surface, there are layers. The layers include softer sedimentary rock, and within those softer layers there are cavities. Some of those cavities are natural, the result of dissolution and fracture that has operated on the softer rock over millions of years. Some of them, according to the records of the people who have found them, are not natural. The geological survey records for the Stirling area are more detailed than those for most comparable sites in Scotland, largely because of the area's long military importance. You do not hold a strategically critical position on a volcanic plug for 800 years without developing an interest in the structural integrity of the rock beneath you. The castle has been surveyed, studied, and its geological context examined repeatedly over the centuries for exactly this reason. The people who held the castle needed to know whether the rock they were defending was solid and whether any weakness in it could be exploited by an enemy who dug. The first systematic survey of the crag's geology that produced written records survives in fragments in the Scottish Records Office in Edinburgh. It dates from the early decades of the 18th century and was commissioned by the military governors of the castle in the period following the Jacobite risings. The officers of the garrison needed to assess whether the underground approaches to the castle were secure, and their surveyors went into the rock to find out. The report they produced is a practical document, written by engineers for military purposes. It describes the known tunnels, identifies fracture zones in the basalt, and makes recommendations about reinforcement. In the middle section of the report, between a description of a known passage on the eastern approach and a recommendation about drainage on the western face, there are 4 paragraphs that deal with something the surveyors found on the south side of the crag that they had not been looking for. The paragraphs are careful. They describe a section of the crag's lower face, where the basalt appears to sit on a void, and where, in the words of the lead surveyor, openings in the face of the lower rock present themselves that are inconsistent with natural formation, and that appear to lead into a passage of substantial depth. The surveyors did not enter. They noted the position. They recommended that the matter be referred to the senior officer of the garrison, and then the report moved on to the drainage recommendation. The referral to the senior officer is recorded in the garrison's administrative correspondence. The senior officer acknowledged the referral and noted that he had considered it and determined that the passage in question had been known to previous occupants of the castle and that its current condition was satisfactory for the castle's purposes. The determination is stated without elaboration. The phrase, satisfactory for the castle's purposes, implies that there had been a judgment made about what the castle's purposes required, and that the judgment was that the passage in question did not require further investigation. The garrison's correspondence then proceeds to other matters. The question of the passage on the south face of the crag is not raised again in the 18th century military records that are available in the archives. Whether it was raised in records that are not available is impossible to determine from the outside. What is available, from a completely different source and a completely different context, is a description of the same area of the south face of the crag from a period approximately 30 years earlier, during the Jacobite garrison, that held the castle in 1715 and 1716. The description comes not from military records but from a private letter written by an officer of the garrison to his brother, a letter that survived in a private family collection and was donated to the National Library of Scotland in the 1980s. The letter is about many things, as private letters are, and the passage about the crag is embedded in a paragraph about the conditions of the garrison's situation. But the passage is specific, and it is interesting in the context of the later military survey. The officer writes that during the garrison's occupation, men had been sent into the lower parts of the crag to assess the defensive situation, and that those men had found, on the south side below the main rock, what he describes as doors in the stone that had been shut by someone a long time ago and that no one in the garrison could open. The word doors is striking. The officer does not use it metaphorically. He describes what the men found as doors, made of a heavy dark material that he could not identify from his correspondent's description, set in frames within the openings in the rock face, and fastened in a way that the garrison's men could not work loose. The men had reported what they found, and the garrison's commander had directed that the position be noted and the matter left alone. The commander's direction to leave the matter alone is not elaborated in the letter. The officer does not indicate that the commander gave a reason. He records only that the direction was given and followed, and that the doors in the stone on the south face of the crag remained shut for the duration of the garrison's occupancy. The letter then moves to the officer's thoughts on the military situation and his hopes for his family's prospects in the event of different outcomes. The parallel between the Jacobite garrison's encounter and the 18th century military survey's reference to the same area of the south face is what makes both documents significant. Two separate groups of military men, separated by approximately 30 years, encountered the same feature on the south face of the Stirling crag and responded in the same way. Note the position, refer it upward, receive a direction to leave it alone, move on. The consistency of the response, across two different military occupations with different political affiliations and different command structures, suggests that the direction to leave it alone reflected something more than individual discretion. It reflected an established understanding about what the feature was and how it should be handled. Where that understanding came from, and how it was transmitted between the two garrison periods, is a question that the available records do not answer. Stirling's geological character makes the existence of void spaces beneath the crag geologically reasonable. The basalt plug sits on older sedimentary rock that includes limestone and sandstone formations, and those formations are prone to the kind of dissolution and fracturing that produces natural void spaces. The Stirling area contains documented examples of such void spaces, and the relationship between the basalt of the plug and the sedimentary rock beneath it has been of interest to geologists for well over a century. But the geological account of void spaces in the rock around Stirling does not, by itself, explain the features described in the military records. Natural void spaces do not have doors made of heavy dark material, set in frames, and fastened against entry. The features in the military records are described in terms that imply construction. Doors suggest framing, facing implies worked stone or a worked material, and fastening implies engineering. The rheological account is not adequate to explain what the military records describe, and the people who wrote those records knew the difference between a natural opening in rock and a constructed passage with a sealed entrance. The constructed character of what the military records describe points toward a different kind of explanation, one that begins not with geology but with history. And the history of Stirling is, in the relevant periods, a history of a place that was more significant and more complex than the castle on a rock narrative that most people are familiar with. Stirling has been a significant place for a very long time. The volcanic plug is a natural defensive position of extraordinary quality, and any people living in the Forth Valley in any period would have been aware of it and would have made use of it. The castle that stands on the crag today dates in its present form from the medieval and early modern periods, but the crag had been occupied for purposes of defence and ceremony long before the medieval castle was built. The question is what those earlier occupants left behind, and what they built, and whether what they built is what the later military records are describing. The Pictish use of the Stirling Crag is documented in the indirect way that Pictish activity is typically documented through symbol stones and the archaeological record of Pictish settlement in the Forth Valley. The Picts were the dominant culture of northern Britain in the period between the Roman withdrawal and the emergence of the Kingdom of Alba that eventually became Scotland. Their symbolic system, expressed in the carved stones that survive across northern Scotland, is still not fully understood. The symbols are geometric, complex, and apparently systematic, but their meaning has not been decoded in any comprehensive way. Among the Pictish symbol stones of the Forth Valley region, there are several that have been interpreted by specialists as relating specifically to the Stirling Crag and its immediate landscape. The interpretation of Pictish symbols is contested, and any specific claim about what a particular symbol means should be held carefully. But among the specialists who have worked on the stones of the Stirling area, there is a recurring observation. Certain stones in the region include what appears to be a representation of the crag itself, and on or adjacent to that representation, symbols that, in the specialist literature, have been interpreted as indicating a significant site that exists at or below a prominent geographical feature. The interpretation of these symbols as referencing a subsurface site is not universally accepted. It is advanced by a minority of Pictish scholars and contested by others who read the same symbols differently. What is interesting is not the interpretation itself, but the fact that it arises at all. The Pictish symbol system clearly referenced places, events, and social structures of importance. If the symbols near representations of the Stirling Crag are understood by some specialists to be referencing something below or within the crag, that interpretation reflects what those specialists see in the symbols and in the context of their placement. The Picts were not the only pre-medieval inhabitants of the Stirling area who left records of unusual significance attached to the crag. The Romans, whose northern frontier at various periods ran through or near the Forth Valley, recorded their interactions with the landscape of the region in ways that have been partially preserved in the historical and archaeological record. The Roman military presence in the area, during the periods of the Antonine Wall in particular, produced survey records and administrative correspondence that survive in fragmentary form. Within the surviving Roman-era records relating to the Forth Valley, there are references to a feature associated with what appears to be the Stirling Crag that have attracted limited specialist attention over the years. The references are in administrative Latin, and they use the word fanum, which typically refers to a sacred enclosure or shrine, in connection with a description of a site at or near the prominent rock of the Forth Crossing. The use of fanum in this context implies that the Romans recognized the site as having a sacred character that predated their own presence, which is consistent with Roman practice in general. The Romans frequently identified and recorded sites that the native populations considered sacred, sometimes incorporating them into their own religious practices and sometimes simply noting them for administrative purposes. The fanum reference in the Forth Valley records has been discussed in a small number of academic papers dealing with Roman period archaeology in central Scotland. The consensus view among the specialists who have addressed it is that it probably refers to a native shrine of some kind associated with the prominent landscape feature of the crag, and that the Roman record of it reflects normal Roman administrative attention to significant local religious sites. What the consensus view does not address is the specific physical description that accompanies the fanum reference in at least one of the surviving fragments. The fragment, which is preserved in a copy of a copy and whose authenticity has been discussed but not definitively resolved in the specialist literature, describes the fanum not as a surface structure but as something that is entered from the surface rather than standing on it. The Latin is ambiguous, as fragmentary Latin often is, and the translation is contested. But one reading of the relevant passage is that what the Romans were recording was not a surface shrine, but a below-surface feature, accessed through an opening in the rock that had sacred significance in the native tradition. If that reading is correct, then the Roman record is describing the same category of feature that the military records of the 18th century describe, a below-surface construction associated with the Stirling crag that had been in place before any of the groups recording it arrived, and that each of those groups chose to handle with a combination of documentation and leave alone. The medieval record adds another layer. Stirling was, during the medieval period, one of the most important strategic and ceremonial sites in Scotland. The castle was not merely a military fortification, it was a royal residence, a site of coronation, a place where the business of the Scottish kingdom was conducted. The importance of the site gave it a detailed documentary record by the standards of medieval Scotland, and within that record there are passages that deal with the physical character of the crag and the spaces within it that are not purely administrative in character. The most significant of these passages occurs in a documentary source relating to the period of Robert the Bruce and the years following Bannockburn. The source is not primarily about Stirling. It is a general administrative document dealing with various matters of the Scottish kingdom in the post-Bannockburn period. But in a section dealing with the disposition of properties and resources associated with the royal castles, there is a reference to the crag at Stirling and to what is described as the lower place beneath the castle that is kept in the state in which it was found. The phrase "in the state in which it was found" is the interesting element. A natural feature of the landscape does not need to be kept in any particular state. It is what it is. Something that can be kept in a state implies that maintaining it is a considered decision and that a different decision could be made. The phrase implies that there is something to maintain and that the decision about how to maintain it has been made. It will be kept in the state in which it was found, not investigated further, not altered. In the state in which it was found. The source does not elaborate on what was found, or on who found it, or on when the finding took place. It records the decision about maintenance and moves on, but the decision it records is the same decision that the military records of 5 centuries later record, and the same decision that the Jacobite garrison officer's private letter describes. Something significant was found beneath the Stirling crag, and the decision about how to handle it was to maintain it in its existing state and leave it alone. The pattern that emerges across these separate records, from the Roman Fanum reference to the medieval documentary source to the Jacobite garrison's private correspondence to the 18th century military survey, is a pattern of consistent management across a very long period. Different institutions, different political contexts, different purposes and frameworks, all arriving at the same decision about the same feature in the same location. This kind of cross-institutional consistency in the investigation of any historical phenomenon is significant. It does not prove a specific explanation for what is beneath the Stirling crag, but it does establish that what is there has been there long enough and has been encountered often enough that multiple independent groups have found it and responded to it, and that their responses have been consistent in a way that reflects something about the character of what they found. The Victorian period added new pressure to the question. The 19th century was a period of extensive urban development in Stirling, as in all Scottish towns of similar size, and the development brought with it construction activity that reached into the ground in ways that earlier periods had not. Drainage works, foundation excavations, road widening, and the construction of the railway all brought workers into proximity with the underground character of the Stirling town site in ways that generated new documentation about what was there. The drainage works of 1817 are the most thoroughly documented of the Victorian-era underground encounters in Stirling. The records of those works, held in the Stirling Council archive, include daily progress reports from the foreman overseeing the excavation, and those reports occasionally note what was encountered in the course of the digging that was not expected. The notations are practical. The workers are reporting conditions to their supervisors, and the conditions include the character of the ground and anything unusual about it. In the progress reports for the drainage works on the south side of the town, in the section of the works that passed closest to the lower face of the crag, There are three notations that stand out from the routine reports of soil conditions and stone formations. The first notes the encounter with work stone at a depth considerably greater than the depth of any known previous construction in the area. The second describes what the foreman calls a floored space, meaning an underground area with a flat constructed floor that the drainage cut had passed adjacent to without penetrating. The third notes that the engineer overseeing the works had been informed and had directed that the cut be redirected to avoid further contact with the floored space. The redirection of the drainage cut is documented in the works plans, which show a clear deviation from the projected route at the point corresponding to the foreman's notation. The deviation is not explained in the works plans themselves. The plans show only that the route changed. The explanation for the change is in the foreman's progress report, where it is attributed to the engineer's direction, and the explanation for the engineer's direction is not documented anywhere in the council archive. The engineer's name is in the records. He was a civil engineer of established reputation who worked on several significant infrastructure projects in central Scotland during the first half of the 19th century. His papers, to the extent that they are preserved, are held in a private collection that has been partially donated to the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland. The portion dealing with his Stirling work does not include any document that elaborates on the direction to redirect the drainage cut. The decision appears to have been made, communicated verbally to the foreman, and noted in the foreman's report, without any written explanation from the engineer himself. The absence of an explanation is not necessarily meaningful. Engineers make practical decisions in the course of works for reasons that do not always make it into written records. A floored space encountered unexpectedly during drainage excavation could be handled by redirection for entirely practical reasons. Avoiding the collapse of an unexpected void is sensible engineering regardless of the origin of the void. But the consistency of the pattern is hard to ignore. The engineer's practical decision to redirect the cut around the floored space is, functionally, the same decision that the military surveyors made, and the Jacobite garrison commander made, and the royal administrators of the post-Bannockburn period made, and whatever tradition the Roman Fanum reference reflects. Note the feature. Do not disturb it. Continue with other purposes. The 20th century brought new methods to the investigation of the Stirling underground, and those methods produced new documentation. The development of ground-penetrating radar and geophysical survey techniques in the second half of the 20th century gave archaeologists and planners tools for seeing beneath the surface without excavating, and those tools were applied, over several decades, to the Stirling area in various contexts. The most significant geophysical survey of the Stirling underground in terms of what it found and how those findings were handled was conducted in the early years of the 21st century in connection with a heritage management plan for the castle and its immediate surroundings. The survey used a combination of ground-penetrating radar and resistivity measurements to build a picture of the subsurface features in the area around the castle, with the aim of informing decisions about future development and management. The results of that survey were published in a summary form that is available through Historic Environment Scotland. The summary describes the general character of the subsurface in the survey area, notes the presence of various features consistent with the documented construction history of the castle, and identifies certain anomalies that require further investigation. The summary is not the full survey report. The full survey report, which runs to considerably more pages than the summary, and includes the specific data from the radar and resistivity measurements, is held by Historic Environment Scotland in its technical archive. Access to the full report is available to researchers who can demonstrate a specific need for the detailed technical data, but the general public version of the document is the summary. A researcher who was working on a doctoral thesis relating to the medieval archaeology of the Stirling area applied for access to the full survey report and was granted it. The researcher noted, in the published version of the thesis, that the full report contained descriptions of subsurface features on the south side of the crag that were not mentioned in the summary document, and that those features had been characterized in the report as requiring specialized assessment before any further investigation could be responsibly conducted. The researcher noted the gap between the summary and the full report without elaborating on what the full report said about the features in question, stating only that the specialized assessment had not, as of the date of the thesis, been conducted. The thesis was defended in 2007. The specialized assessment that the full survey report recommended has not, as far as is publicly known, been conducted or published. The south side of the Stirling Crag continues to be described in the publicly available heritage documentation as an area of archaeological potential that will require assessment before any future ground disturbance. Area of archaeological potential is a phrase that appears in heritage management documents all over Scotland and all over the world. It is applied to places where the archaeology has not been fully investigated, which covers an enormous proportion of the country's land surface. The phrase, by itself, is unremarkable. What is remarkable is the concentration of separate documentary references to the same specific area of the south side of the Stirling Crag, across a period spanning from the Roman administrative record to the 21st century heritage survey, all of which describe something in that area that is not routine and all of which reach the same conclusion about what to do with it. The conclusion is consistent: note it, characterize it minimally, decline to investigate further, and continue with other purposes. The medieval town of Stirling was not just the castle and its immediate surroundings. The settlement that grew up around and below the crag was itself a substantial place, and the physical record of that settlement extends below the current ground surface in ways that the long history of construction and reconstruction in the town have complicated but not entirely destroyed. The older parts of the town sit on deep stratigraphic sequences that preserve the record of successive periods of occupation, and the character of that record, where it has been investigated, is more complex than the above-ground townscape suggests. The investigation of the Stirling town site's subsurface record has been ongoing in a piecemeal way for many decades, driven by development pressure and the associated requirement for archaeological evaluation before construction can proceed. The results of these evaluations are published in the Grey Literature of Scottish Archaeology, reports that are archived by Historic Environment Scotland and available to researchers but rarely synthesized into a comprehensive account of what they collectively reveal. When the available evaluation reports for the Stirling town site are read as a collection rather than individually, a picture emerges that is more interesting than any individual report suggests. The picture is of a town with a subsurface record that extends significantly deeper than the medieval deposits that most of the evaluations focus on, and that contains, at certain specific locations, features that the evaluating archaeologists have consistently struggled to place within the expected stratigraphic sequence. The features that cause this difficulty are not uniform in character. They include what several separate evaluations describe as anomalous stone settings at depth, meaning stone structures whose character and position do not correspond to any known construction phase of the medieval or post-medieval town. They include what one evaluation calls a prepared surface of considerable antiquity at a depth that places it well below the earliest confirmed medieval deposits. And they include, in the evaluation of a site on the south side of the town closest to the crag, a description of a feature that the evaluating archaeologist characterized as a structured opening in the bedrock of the crag's lower face that appeared to have been deliberately constructed. The description of a structured opening in the bedrock is, once again, consistent with the earlier documentary record. The evaluation was conducted in the 1990s in connection with a small development project. The evaluation report is in the Historic Environment Scotland archive. The evaluation recommended a program of further investigation that would clarify the character and significance of the structured opening. The further investigation was not conducted. The development proceeded with a modified design that avoided the relevant area. And the structured opening in the lower face of the Stirling Crag, whatever it is and wherever it leads, remains uninvestigated. The pattern of evaluation finding, recommendation for further investigation, and decision to proceed without acting on the recommendation is, once again, a consistent one. The specific decision to avoid rather than investigate is not always explained in the documentation. Sometimes it is attributed to cost. Sometimes it is attributed to the modification of the development design. Sometimes there is simply no explanation. The recommendation is made and the evaluation report is archived, and the next document in the sequence is the approval of the development without the recommended investigation. What connects these separate instances of the same pattern is not a single institutional decision. It is a distributed pattern of response to a distributed phenomenon, in which the people who encounter evidence of something significant beneath Stirling consistently and independently reach the same conclusion about what to do. Document it minimally, avoid it, continue with other purposes. The word beneath deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of Stirling's archaeology. The standard account of the Stirling Underground focuses on the known tunnels of the castle and the adjacent town, features that are documented, that have been partially investigated, and that are understood within the framework of medieval and post-medieval military engineering. The tunnels are real and they are interesting, but they are not the deepest layer of what is beneath Stirling. Below the known tunnels, below the medieval and post-medieval construction, below the early medieval and Pictish deposits, there is a layer of the subsurface that the standard account does not have an adequate framework for. This layer is not well documented because most of the documentation of it is in the kind of records this account has been discussing: administrative notes, engineering reports, military correspondence, archaeological evaluation recommendations, all of which describe something significant and all of which then move on without investigating it. What is in this deeper layer is not publicly known because the investigation that would establish what is there has not been conducted. What is known is the character of the features that have been partially observed and consistently declined to be investigated. The character is consistent. The features appear to be constructed. They appear to be old in a way that predates the known historical sequence of the site, and they appear to be associated specifically with the south side of the volcanic crag rather than with the broader town site. This specificity is significant. If the features were randomly distributed across the Stirling Underground, they might be explained by the complex and layered history of a site that has been continuously occupied and modified for many centuries. The concentration of anomalous features on the south side of the crag suggests that the south side is not randomly significant. It is a specific location with a specific character that has been noted by everyone who has encountered it across a period of roughly 2,000 years. The south face of the Stirling Crag has a geological character that distinguishes it from other parts of the plug. The contact between the basalt of the plug and the sedimentary rock beneath is not uniform around the circumference of the crag. On the south side, the transition from basalt to the softer underlying material is more gradual, and the fracturing of both the basalt and the underlying material is more extensive than on the north and west faces. This geological character makes the south side both more permeable and more structurally complex than the other faces, and it is this complexity that both makes the presence of void spaces more likely and makes them more accessible from the outside. The accessibility of the south face is one of the reasons why the military records focus on it. A potential weakness in the defensive perimeter of the castle must be assessed and managed. The military surveyors who entered the south face in the 18th century were doing exactly what military surveyors are supposed to do. They found something that they were not looking for, something that did not fit within the framework of what they expected to find in an assessment of military vulnerabilities, and they responded to it in the way that the institutional culture of the time prescribed. Refer it upward, receive a direction to leave it alone, move on. The institutional culture of Georgian military engineering did not have a framework for what they apparently found. It had a framework for natural void spaces, for enemy tunneling operations, for the deterioration of masonry, and for water infiltration. It did not have a framework for constructed passages that predated the castle and whose origin could not be attributed to any historical period or cultural group that the surveyors could identify. When you find something that does not fit your framework, and the decision about how to handle it is being made by a military officer with practical responsibilities and a garrison to manage, the most functionally reasonable decision is to leave it alone and get on with the job. This is not suppression in any conspiratorial sense. It is the pragmatic management of an anomaly by people whose job is not to investigate anomalies but to maintain a military position. The anomaly gets noted, the decision to leave it alone gets made and communicated, and the institutional record moves on. The anomaly, whatever it is, remains where it is, unchanged by the decision and unaffected by the management. What would have happened if the Georgian military surveyors had decided differently, if they had entered the passages on the south face and attempted to follow them to their end, is a question that cannot be answered. What can be said is that the decision they made has been made, in one form or another, every time the question has arisen in the documented history of the site, and that the cumulative effect of all those decisions is that whatever is beneath Stirling remains beneath Stirling, uninvestigated and unseen, except by the few people who have gotten close enough to its edges to describe what they encountered there. The archaeological record of Stirling, taken in the round, is a record of a place that has been continuously occupied for at least 10,000 years. The post-glacial history of the Forth Valley begins with the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheets equivalent in Scotland to the ice that covered the country during the last glacial maximum and that retreated northward beginning approximately 15,000 years ago. The land that was revealed by the retreating ice was initially bare rock and glacial deposit, and it was colonized gradually by vegetation, by animals, and by the human populations that followed both. The Forth Valley was, in the post-glacial period, an ecologically significant environment. The combination of river, estuary, and elevated ground provided the resources that early human populations depended on: fish, game, plant foods, fresh water, and defensible positions. The volcanic plug of Stirling, with its commanding view over the valley and its access to the resources of the Forth, would have been recognized as a significant place from the earliest period of human presence in the region. The evidence for this early human presence is, in the Stirling area, thin in comparison to the evidence from some other Scottish sites, partly because the long history of occupation and construction has disturbed and obscured the earliest layers. But the evidence that does exist, from chance finds and from the evaluations that have gone deep enough to reach the earliest deposits, suggests a human presence in the area going back to the Mesolithic period, the epoch of hunter-gatherers who lived in Scotland between the retreat of the ice and the arrival of agriculture. Mesolithic people in Scotland were not technologically primitive. They were sophisticated managers of their environment, with detailed knowledge of the ecological systems they depended on and the organizational capacity to exploit those systems effectively. They built structures, both for habitation and for other purposes, and they modified the landscape in ways that are only now beginning to be recognized and understood as the result of deliberate management rather than natural process. Whether Mesolithic people used the Stirling Crag and what they may have found in or under it is not documented in any record this account has access to. The question is raised not to suggest an answer, but to indicate the depth of the relevant timescale. The features beneath the Stirling Crag, whatever their age, have been in place through the entire span of post-glacial human occupation of the Forth Valley, through the Mesolithic, through the Neolithic, through the Bronze Age, through the Iron Age, through the Pictish period, through the medieval Scottish kingdom, and through the 4 centuries of documented military and administrative management that followed. That is a very long time for something to remain in place and to resist, at each period of encounter, the decision to investigate it further. The pre-contact dimension of this story extends beyond Scotland itself. The connections between Scotland and North America in the pre-Columbian period are, like the connections described in other accounts in this series, a matter of contested academic opinion and active research. The question of whether there was meaningful contact across the North Atlantic before the Norse voyages of the late first millennium is not settled, and the evidence that bears on it comes from multiple disciplines and multiple lines of argument. What is directly relevant to the story of what is beneath Stirling is the pattern of response that the various encounters with the subsurface features have produced. That pattern, as this account has shown, is consistent across very different cultural and institutional contexts. And one of the things that consistent patterns of response can suggest, when they appear across widely separated contexts, is a common source for the pattern, a common reason why different groups in different periods all responded the same way. The common source might be shared institutional knowledge passed down through channels that are not fully documented. It might be shared experience of what happened to people who did not respond that way. Or it might be something about the nature of what is in the ground itself, something that imposes the same response on everyone who gets close enough to encounter it, regardless of their cultural background or their institutional context. The oral traditions of the Scottish Highlands and Islands, which have their own long memory of significant places in the landscape, include accounts of features in the ground at various locations across the country that are described in terms broadly similar to those used in the institutional records. Places that were there before any living tradition can remember. that have their own relationship with the surface world, and that are to be recognized and left alone, rather than investigated. The specific traditions vary by location and by cultural group, but the broad category of understanding that certain features of the deep ground have a character that requires a particular kind of attention is widely distributed across the Scottish oral tradition. The Gaelic word for such places, in the tradition that maintained itself across the Highlands and Islands through the disruptions of the last several centuries, does not translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation is something like the places that hold the old arrangement. The arrangement in question is not human-made, or not primarily. It is older than the human relationship with the place, and the human recognition of it is a response to something that was already in place before the first people arrived to notice it. This framing of a place that holds an arrangement that predates human presence is consistent with the character of the features described in the Stirling records. The features are described, across all the periods of their documentation, as things that were found rather than things that were built. The Roman fanum reference implies that what the Romans identified was already there when they arrived. The medieval documentary reference describes the lower place as found rather than constructed. The Jacobite officer's letter describes doors that were shut by someone a long time ago without specifying who or when. The later military survey and the Victorian drainage works both describe encounters with features whose origin is not attributed to any identifiable historical construction phase. Things that were found, not built. Things that were in place before the documented history of the site began. Things that have been found, repeatedly, by different groups in different periods, and that have consistently been left in the state in which they were found. The Castle of Stirling was one of the most important sites in medieval Scotland. Its importance was not purely military. The castle was a site of coronation, of royal ceremony, and of the kind of symbolic significance that accumulates in places that have been recognised as important across many generations. Mary, Queen of Scots, was crowned there in 1543. James IV held court there. James III was born there. The symbolic weight of the site is immense, built up from centuries of royal attention and ceremony. That symbolic weight is part of the reason why the features beneath the crag have been managed so carefully and so consistently. A site of such importance cannot afford the disruption that an unexplained and unexplainable discovery would create. The people who managed the castle, across its centuries as a royal residence and military stronghold, had practical and political reasons to maintain the established order of things, and the established order included the management of what was beneath the crag in the state in which it was found. The management of the symbolic importance of the site required that certain questions not be raised in public, not because the answers would necessarily be catastrophic, but because the questions themselves would be destabilizing. A royal site whose foundations are subject to anomalies that cannot be explained within the available framework is a different kind of royal site from one that is simply ancient and well defended. The first kind raises questions that the second kind does not. The people who managed the castle had strong institutional incentives to ensure that the questions were not raised. The institutional management of information about what is beneath the Stirling Crag has been less formal in recent centuries than in earlier periods, but it has remained consistent. The pattern of archaeological evaluations that identify significant features, recommend further investigation, and then proceed without acting on the recommendation is not the product of a formal policy of suppression. It is the accumulated result of individual decisions made under practical constraints within institutional cultures that prioritize the completion of current projects over the investigation of unexpected findings, and in a regulatory environment where the requirement for archaeological assessment is balanced against the requirement for timely development. The pattern is institutional in character, without being deliberately managed from the top. No one in historic environment Scotland is making a decision to conceal what is beneath the Stirling Crag. The organisation processes an enormous volume of archaeological data from evaluations across Scotland, and most of that data is available to the public in one form or another. What is not always available is the full detail of evaluations that identified significant anomalies, and the reason for that unavailability is often simply practical. The full technical reports are archived and available on request, but they are not highlighted or synthesized, and the anomalies they contain are noted in the summary documentation in language that is technically accurate but practically opaque to a non-specialist reader. Area of archaeological potential. anomalous subsurface feature requiring specialized assessment, features inconsistent with the documented construction sequence. These are the phrases that appear in the summary documents and that, for a specialist reader, indicate that something significant was found that has not been followed up. For a non-specialist reader, the same phrases read as routine archaeological boilerplate, the standard language of a discipline that routinely encounters more than it can investigate with available resources. The gap between what the specialist language is saying and what the non-specialist reader understands it to be saying is not a gap that was deliberately created, but it is a gap that, functionally, serves the same purpose that earlier and more deliberate forms of the leave-it-alone decision served. The anomalies are noted. They are documented in language that is technically accurate, and they are presented in a form that does not invite the kind of sustained public attention that would require them to be followed up. The south side of the Stirling Crag is, in the current heritage management framework, an area of deferred investigation. The deferred investigation has been deferred since before the Victorian drainage works. It has been deferred since before the Georgian military survey. If the reading of the medieval documentary reference is correct, it has been deferred since the post-Bannockburn period. And if the Roman Fanum reference is describing the same feature, it has been recognized as significant and left in the state in which it was found for somewhere in the region of 2,000 years. 2,000 years of deferral. 2,000 years of consistent management across Roman administrators and Pictish cultural practitioners and medieval Scottish kings and Jacobite military officers and Victorian engineers and 20th century archaeologists, all encountering the same feature, all making the same decision, all moving on. That duration and that consistency is the most significant fact about what is beneath Stirling. The thing itself, whatever it is significant enough that everyone who has encountered it has found it significant. The significance has been recognized repeatedly, across enormous spans of time and across cultures that had no direct connection with each other. And in each case, the recognition of significance has produced not investigation, but deference, not a decision to understand, but a decision to leave alone. The features beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag that have been partially observed across all the periods and methods of observation that the documentary record reflects, share certain characteristics that emerge from comparing the available descriptions. They appear to be constructed. The word that recurs across the descriptions, in various translations and paraphrases, is one that implies human intention: doors, openings, structured, prepared, worked. The features are not being described as natural void spaces in the rock. They are being described as made things. They appear to be old. The consistent description of the features as things that were found rather than built, and the difficulty of attributing them to any known construction phase of the site, suggests that they predate the documented historical sequence. The Roman reference, if it is indeed describing the same feature, would place their recognition by a literate administrative culture at approximately 2,000 years ago. What predates that recognition is not documented. They appear to be associated with a specific location: the south side of the crag, at or below the transition from the basalt of the plug to the softer sedimentary rock beneath. This specificity of location is consistent across descriptions from different periods, using different methods of investigation. It is not a diffuse anomaly distributed across the whole site. It is a concentrated feature at a specific place. And they appear to be passable. The descriptions that go furthest toward characterizing what the features contain use words and phrases that imply depth. Passage of substantial depth leads into a passage, structured opening. The features appear to open onto something that extends beyond the point of observation. What that something is, and how far it extends, and what it contains, is not described in any document that is publicly available. What is beneath Stirling is, on the evidence of 2,000 years of documented management, something constructed, old, specifically located, and deep. Something that has been recognized as significant by every group that has encountered it, and that every group has chosen to leave in the state in which they found it. The question of who made it, and when, and for what purpose, is the question that the consistent pattern of deferral has kept from being answered for as long as there have been people on the Forth Valley looking up at the volcanic crag and making decisions about it. The geological context of the Stirling Crag places it at a specific position in the ancient landscape of northern Britain. The Forth Valley was, in the period following the retreat of the last glaciation, a significant ecological corridor between the eastern lowlands and the western coast, and it was also a significant geographical boundary between the highlands to the north and the lowlands to the south. The crag sits at the point where the valley narrows, which is why it has been the strategic key to the north-south movement of armies and peoples for as long as anyone has been moving through Scotland. This strategic position was not created by the people who recognized it. It was created by the geology, by the specific configuration of the volcanic plug and the floodplain and the river that determined where a crossing was possible and where it was not. The people who came and went across this landscape recognized the geological reality and organized their settlement, their defense, and their ceremony around it. The features beneath the crag were presumably also recognized by the people who made them, whoever they were, as being in a specific relationship with that same geological reality. The south face of the crag, where the basalt transitions to the softer rock beneath, is the most accessible part of the crag's lower structure. It is the face that looks across the valley toward the lowlands. It is the face that a traveller coming up the valley from the south would see first, and it is the face that any builder working with the geology of the site would find most amenable to the kind of construction that the documentary record describes. Who those builders were, and what tradition they were part of, and what they understood themselves to be making, is the central unanswered question. The consistent description of the features as constructed and old suggests a building event that took place at a time that predates the written historical record for Scotland, whose written history begins, effectively, with the Roman records of the late 1st century CE, and the Roman Fanum reference suggests that the feature was already old enough to be recognized as significant by native peoples when the Romans arrived. That recognition implies a tradition of understanding that was already established, which implies origins that are considerably earlier than the Roman period. A feature beneath the Stirling Crag that was already old when the Romans arrived 2,000 years ago has been in place for at minimum several thousand years. How many more thousands is not determinable from the available evidence, but the geological stability of the basalt plug provides no constraint on how long a constructed feature within the adjacent softer rock could have persisted. The Stirling Crag has been geologically stable in its basic configuration since the glaciation ended. Something built into the south face of the crag in the early post-glacial period could, in principle, still be in the same condition now as it was when it was built, provided it had not been disturbed. The consistent management across all the periods of documented encounter suggests that it has not been disturbed. The decision to leave it in the state in which it was found, made repeatedly across 2,000 years of documented history, appears to have been followed. Whatever is beneath Stirling is presumably in the same condition it has been in for a very long time, maintained by the accumulated weight of a management tradition that each group of people who encountered it joined without, in most cases, knowing that they were joining a tradition that had been in place since before their own history began. The public archaeology of Stirling focuses, appropriately enough, on what is known. The castle is one of the finest examples of Renaissance architecture in Scotland. Its great hall and forework are of international significance. The medieval and early modern history of the site is rich and well documented. The archaeological investigations that have been conducted at the castle and in the town have produced important findings about the life and material culture of the people who lived and worked at this significant location over the possibly centuries. All of that public archaeology is real and valuable. It represents what can be known about Stirling within the existing framework of archaeological investigation. But within that framework, and sometimes at its edges, there are the persistent notes of something that falls outside the framework, the evaluation reports with their anomalous features, the archive documents with their recommendations for further investigation, the summary documents with their careful language about archaeological potential, and behind all of them, the older records of a Georgian military survey and a Victorian drainage works, and a medieval documentary reference, and a Roman administrative note, all pointing toward the same location on the south side of the crag, and all arriving at the same conclusion about what to do with what they found there. The conclusion has not changed. The framework for understanding what they found has not been developed. The specialized assessment that would clarify the character and significance of the features has not been conducted. The features remain in the state in which they were found, as they have apparently been maintained for the full span of time that the documentary record covers, and presumably for the longer span of time that precedes the documentary record. What is beneath Stirling is old, and it is still there, and it is still sealed in the way that the Jacobite officer's letter described it, closed by someone a long time ago, never reopened. And the pattern of leaving it that way, which has held for as long as anyone can document, and presumably for much longer, is still intact, maintained now by the same combination of practical constraint and institutional habit, and the accumulated weight of all the decisions that came before, that has maintained it through every period of the site's long and well-documented history. The volcanic rock of the Stirling Crag does not change on a human timescale. The basalt is old and stable and indifferent to the processes that the surface above it goes through. Wars, coronations, construction projects, archaeological evaluations, heritage management plans, none of these affect the character of the crag itself. The crag is what it is, with what it contains, regardless of what the surface world decides about how to deal with the documentation of that content. The south face still presents itself to the valley. The Forth still runs below. The town still sits on the lower slopes, and somewhere in the transition zone between the basalt and the softer rock beneath, in the specific location that has been identified in records spanning 2,000 years of encounter, something constructed and old and still sealed continues to be what it is. Patient in the stone, waiting with the particular patience of things that have outlasted every decision that was made about them and every institution that made those decisions. The next time someone digs in the right place on the south side of Stirling, with the right questions and the willingness to follow the findings wherever they lead, the thing that is there will still be there, closed by someone a long time ago, in the state in which it was found, waiting, as it has always been waiting, for the question to finally be asked and answered. The specificity of what the documentary record points to is worth emphasizing before going further into what surrounds and supports it. The records this account has been discussing are not records of a vague tradition about underground significance at Stirling. They are records of specific encounters with specific features at a specific location. The location is the south face of the volcanic crag. The features are described in terms that, across the different languages and conventions of the different periods, converge on a consistent physical picture, worked openings in the rock, sealed by constructed barriers, opening onto passages that extend beyond the point of observation. The convergence of these descriptions is not explained by the standard archaeological account of the Stirling site, which attributes all significant underground features to the documented medieval and post-medieval military and civilian use of the crag. The documented use of the crag does not include the construction of sealed passages in the lower south face. The sealed passages are not attributed to any known historical construction phase. They are, in each period of encounter, described as things that were found rather than built, and that are recognized as significant in a way that cannot be accommodated within the existing framework. The existing framework, in any period, is always limited by the evidence available and the concepts that have been developed to make sense of that evidence. The Georgian military surveyors did not have a concept adequate to explain a sealed passage in the south face of the Stirling Crag that predated all known construction at the site. The Victorian drainage engineers did not have a concept adequate to explain a floored space at a depth inconsistent with any known historical use of the area. The 21st century archaeologists did not have a concept adequate to explain anomalous subsurface features on the south side of the crag that did not correspond to the documented construction sequence. Each group encountered the same limitation and responded in the same way. Document what can be documented, note the anomaly, leave it for someone else to deal with, and get on with the purpose at hand. The accumulated effect of this response, across 2,000 years, is that the anomaly remains undealt with, and the purpose at hand has never included resolving it. The Bannockburn connection deserves more attention than it has received in the historical treatment of the Stirling site. The Battle of Bannockburn, in 1314, was one of the defining events in Scottish history, and its connection to Stirling Castle was direct. The battle was fought, in part, to determine control of the castle, which had been under English occupation. Robert the Bruce's victory at Bannockburn secured Scottish control of the castle and of Stirling with it. The post-Bannockburn period is the period from which the medieval documentary reference about the lower place beneath the castle comes. The document that contains the reference is from the administrative records of the period of Bruce's reign, and it reflects the organisation and management of the royal castle that followed the restoration of Scottish control. The administrators of the post-Bannockburn period were, in other words, the first Scottish royal administrators to have direct access to the full information available about what the castle and its crag contained. What they found, and what they decided to do with it, is what the documentary reference records. They found the lower place, and they decided to keep it in the state in which they found it. The decision is recorded without explanation, which is consistent with the practice of administrative documents that deal with established policy. You record what the policy is, not why it is what it is, because the reasons are assumed to be known to the people who will be reading the document. The assumption that the reasons are known implies that there were reasons, and that those reasons were understood by the people making the decision. The post-Bannockburn administrators were not making a decision in the absence of information. They were making a decision on the basis of what they had found and what they understood about it. The decision to keep the lower place in the state in which it was found was an informed decision, made by people who had seen what was there and who had determined that leaving it alone was the appropriate response. What informed that determination, and where the administrative tradition of leaving the lower place alone had its origin, is not documented. The post-Bannockburn reference may be the earliest written record of the management tradition, but it almost certainly does not represent the beginning of the tradition itself. The language of the reference, with its matter-of-fact description of the lower place and its equally matter-of-fact instruction to maintain it in its existing state, has the quality of institutional instruction rather than original discovery. It reads as the codification of an existing practice rather than the establishment of a new one. If the post-Bannockburn reference is the codification of an existing practice, the practice predates the record. How far it predates the record, and where it began, are questions that the available documentation cannot answer, but that the character of the record makes worth asking. The Roman presence in the Forth Valley is one of the most extensively documented aspects of the region's ancient history, both because the Romans kept records of their activities and because those records have partially survived and been studied by historians and archaeologists for centuries. The Antonine Wall, which crossed the central belt of Scotland from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde, was built during the reign of Antoninus Pius in the 2nd century CE and occupied intermittently for several decades before being abandoned in favour of Hadrian's Wall further south. The Roman fort complex at Camelon, near Falkirk, was one of the significant military installations associated with the Antonine frontier and is relevant to the Stirling area as one of the closest Roman military sites to the Stirling Crag. The administrative and logistical connections between the Antonine installations and the broader Roman province to the south produced a volume of documentation that is, even in its fragmentary survival, more substantial than the documentary record for most of the periods this account has discussed. Within the available Roman documentation for the Forth Valley region, the Fanum reference is not the only indication that the area around the Stirling Crag was of interest to the Roman administrative system in ways that went beyond its obvious strategic significance. There are also references in the supply and logistics records of the Roman frontier to specific locations in the valley that were the subject of what appears to be recurring attention that went beyond what would be expected for routine military purposes. One of these references is to a location on the south bank of the Forth that is identified in the Roman records by a term that translates approximately as the place of the old marking. The phrase old marking in Roman administrative Latin implies a pre-existing feature, something that was there when the Romans arrived, and that they identified as significant for reasons connected to its existing character rather than to anything they themselves had created. The place of the old marking is not precisely located in the Roman records, but its description as being on the south bank of the Forth and in proximity to the prominent natural rock of the valley is consistent with a location on or near the Stirling Crag. The description of it as a place of old marking suggests something that was, from the Roman perspective, both old and marked, a feature that had been recognized and designated by someone before the Romans' arrival. The combination of the Phanom reference and the old marking reference in the Roman documentation for the Fourth Valley produces a picture of a Roman administrative system that was aware of specific, significant features associated with the Stirling Crag, that described those features in terms that acknowledged their pre-Roman character and that recorded them in the administrative record without elaborating on their nature or their significance. This is consistent with Roman practice at sites of pre-Roman significance across the province. The Romans were systematic in their attention to significant features of the landscape of the territories they administered, not out of archaeological curiosity, but out of administrative practicality. Knowing what was where, and what the local populations considered significant, was useful information for a governing power. The documentation of the Stirling area's pre-Roman significant features in the Roman administrative record is therefore not surprising. What is interesting is the consistency of the Roman documentation with the later documentary record of the same features. The place of the old marking and the Phanom, if they are references to the same feature as the medieval lower place and the Georgian military survey's passage in the lower face, suggest a continuity of recognition stretching from the Roman period to the early modern period. A feature that was recognized as significant by the Romans was still being recognized as significant and managed in the same way 17 centuries later. The character of the feature, from the perspective of the groups documenting it, appears to have been unchanged across that span. It was old when the Romans arrived, and it was old when the Georgian surveyors got there, and the decision to leave it alone, which the Romans apparently made and the medieval Scottish administrators apparently made, is still the decision that is being made now. The Forth Valley's geology is relevant to understanding why the specific location of the south face of the Stirling Crag is significant. The valley was formed by the action of glaciers during the last ice age, and the shape it took after the ice retreated has been modified by post-glacial processes of erosion, deposition, and sea level change. The Forth estuary, which now extends well below Stirling, was much shorter in the early post-glacial period, when sea levels were lower and the land was still rebounding from the weight of the glaciers. As the sea level rose during the post-glacial period, the estuary extended further upstream, and the area around what is now Stirling was periodically inundated by marine and estuarine waters. The crag itself would have been an island, or nearly an island, at certain periods of the early Holocene, surrounded by the advancing estuary and standing above the rising water as an isolated prominence in the new landscape. This geomorphological history is significant for understanding the human relationship with the Stirling Crag in the early post-glacial period. A prominent rock rising above the waters of an advancing estuary would have been a remarkable feature to the people who were first colonizing the post-glacial landscape of Scotland. It would have been visible from a great distance. It would have been accessible by water and by land, and it would have had, in the practical ecology of post-glacial Scotland, an obvious significance as a landmark, a refuge, and a reference point for the people moving through the landscape. The people who were in the Forth Valley in the early post-glacial period were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the first human inhabitants of Scotland after the retreat of the ice. They were not technologically simple. Scottish Mesolithic cultures, as understood from the archaeological record, included sophisticated communities with knowledge of marine and terrestrial resources, the ability to exploit seasonally diverse environments, and the organizational capacity to maintain social networks across significant distances. Whether Mesolithic people used the Stirling Crag and what they may have found or made there is not documented. The Mesolithic record for the Stirling area is thin, not because Mesolithic people were necessarily absent, but because the long and intensive history of occupation and construction on the site has obscured and destroyed the earliest layers. What can be said is that the geomorphological history of the site makes it a plausible focus of Mesolithic activity, and that the features in the south face of the crag that have been documented across all the later periods were presumably already in place when the first post-glacial people arrived. If the features in the south face predate Mesolithic occupation, they predate the entire span of human presence in Scotland. If they were made by the Mesolithic people themselves, they are approximately 10,000 years old. If they were made by the Neolithic people who followed the Mesolithic communities, they are approximately 6,000 years old. If they were made by the Bronze Age or Iron Age populations, they are somewhat less old but still predating the historical record. In any of these cases, the features are very old, and the human management of them has been ongoing for a very long time. The Neolithic communities of Scotland were the people who built Maeshowe and the Stones of Stenness and the Ring of Brodgar and Skara Brae, all in Orkney, during the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE. These communities were extraordinary in their organizational capacity and in their ability to mobilize labor for the construction of monumental structures. The sheer scale of the Neolithic monuments of Orkney and the evidence of the sophisticated understanding of astronomy and landscape that their design and siting reflects makes it clear that the Neolithic people of Scotland were capable of major engineering projects that required long-range planning and sustained organizational effort. Whether Neolithic people built or used features beneath the Stirling Crag is not established by the available evidence, but the capability was clearly there. A culture capable of building Maeshowe and the Ring of Brodgar was capable of constructing subsurface passages in the south face of a volcanic plug, and was also capable of recognizing and investing significance in the kind of natural void space that a geological survey would describe as an anomalous feature requiring specialized assessment. The Iron Age communities of the Forth Valley were the immediate predecessors of the Pictish culture that the later historical record begins to document, and they left their own marks on the landscape of the region. The hill forts that characterize the Iron Age landscape of Scotland are, in many cases, directly associated with the same prominent geological features that were significant in earlier periods. The elevated positions, the volcanic crags, the command points over valleys and crossing points. Stirling is a prominent example of this pattern, with the Iron Age use of the crag attested in the archaeological record beneath the later medieval construction. The Iron Age people who used the Stirling Crag were part of a cultural tradition that placed significant emphasis on the relationship between human communities and specific features of the landscape. The sacred geography of Iron Age Scotland, like the sacred geography of other Celtic-descended cultures across northwestern Europe, was organized around the recognition of specific places in the landscape as having particular significance: springs, rivers, elevated positions, and, notably, openings in the earth. The opening in the earth as a significant category in Iron Age cosmology is documented across the Celtic world through the archaeological record of ritual deposits, through the mythological literature of the medieval period that preserves earlier tradition, and through the accounts of classical authors who described the religious practices of the Celtic peoples they encountered. The earth's openings were understood as thresholds between the surface world and what lay beneath, and they were treated with the combination of recognition and careful attention that characterizes the management of sacred sites in general. If the features in the south face of the Stirling Crag were recognized by Iron Age people as a significant opening, that recognition would be consistent with the broader cultural framework of the period. The management tradition of leaving the feature in place and not disturbing it would also be consistent with the Iron Age approach to sacred sites, which typically emphasized the maintenance of appropriate relationships with significant places rather than their exploitation or transformation. The Picts, who appear in the historical record in the early centuries CE, and who were the dominant cultural group of northern Scotland until the formation of the Kingdom of Alba, are in many respects the most mysterious of the cultural groups that have occupied the Forth Valley. Their symbol system is undeciphered. Their language is known only fragmentarily. Their social organization and political structure are understood primarily through inference from the symbol stones and from the accounts of outside observers. But the Picts were clearly a culture with sophisticated understanding of the landscape and with a strong tradition of associating specific significant features of the landscape with specific cultural meanings expressed through their symbol system. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire, the symbol stones that mark significant locations across northern Scotland, and the place name evidence of Pictish geographical recognition all suggest a culture with deep attention to the character of specific places. The Pictish symbol stones associated with the Stirling area and the specialist interpretations of certain symbols as referencing features associated with the crag fit within this broader Pictish cultural pattern of landscape recognition. Whether the Picts were referencing the same features that the later medieval and Georgian records describe is a matter of specialist inference that the available evidence does not allow to be settled definitively. but the inference is consistent with the character of both the Pictish symbol system and the features in question. The Wallace Monument, which stands on Abbey Craig to the northeast of Stirling, is a Victorian structure associated with William Wallace and the Battle of Stirling Bridge of 1297. The Abbey Craig is a smaller volcanic plug of the same geological character as the Stirling Crag, and its immediate vicinity has its own archaeological record. But what is relevant to this account is not the Wallace Monument itself, but the view it provides over the Forth Valley and over the Stirling Crag. From the Wallace Monument, on a clear day, the configuration of the Stirling Crag is visible in a way that emphasizes the geological relationships that have been significant in this account. The south face of the crag, with its more gradual transition from the basalt to the sedimentary rock beneath, is clearly visible as a different character from the vertical north and west faces. The transition zone, where the features described in the documentary record are located, is the accessible lower part of the crag, the part that faces the valley and the approaching traveller. This geographical perspective is relevant to understanding the long history of the features management. The south face is not a hidden or inaccessible part of the crag. It is the most visible face, the face that anyone approaching Stirling from the south, the main direction of approach for much of the site's history, would see first. The features in that face were not concealed by geography. They were visible and accessible to anyone who approached the crag. What concealed them was not natural geography but constructed barriers, the doors in the stone that the Jacobite officer described, the sealed openings that the Georgian surveyors noted. The construction of those barriers, the closing of the passages by someone a long time ago, was itself a significant act. It represents a decision, made at some point in the past, by someone with the knowledge and the capability to seal the passages, that the passages should be closed. The decision to close them is as significant as the decision that each subsequent group of people has made to leave them closed. The original closing was a deliberate act of management, an assertion that the passages should not be open, and that assertion has been respected by everyone who has encountered the result of it across the subsequent centuries. Who made the original decision to close the passages, and on the basis of what knowledge and what understanding of the situation, is the question that underlies all the other questions about what is beneath Stirling. The decision to close something implies knowledge of what is being closed. The people who closed the passages on the south face of the Stirling Crag knew what was in them, and they decided, on the basis of that knowledge, that the passages should be shut. The decision has held for as long as the passages have been shut. The closing has been respected by every group that has encountered the sealed passages since, and the consistent respect for the original decision suggests that the knowledge that motivated it has been, in some form and through some channel, transmitted across the periods of encounter. The knowledge has not always been explicit. The military officers and Victorian engineers who left the passages alone did not necessarily know why the passages had been closed, but they recognized that the closed state was significant and that the appropriate response was to leave it that way. This pattern of respect for a decision whose original reasoning has been lost, but whose result is still recognized as requiring respect, is itself a significant cultural phenomenon. It implies that the significance of the closure has been able to maintain itself across all the changes in the institutional and cultural context in which the closure is encountered. Something about the character of the sealed passages makes each group that encounters them feel the weight of the original decision and respond to it with the same deference. The weight of a decision can be transmitted through many channels. It can be transmitted through formal documentation, which is how the post-Bannockburn administrative reference transmits it. It can be transmitted through oral tradition, which is how the community understanding described in the Gaelic tradition transmits it. It can be transmitted through the accumulated practical knowledge of professional communities, which is how the understanding apparently shared among the 19th century engineers who worked in the Stirling area may have been transmitted. And it can be transmitted, in the most fundamental way, by the features themselves, by whatever it is about what is in the passages that makes each group of people who encounter the sealed entrance decide that the decision to leave it closed was correct. The Stirling area's place in the broader pattern of North American pre-contact connections is not established by a direct evidentiary thread, but by its position within the larger pattern of the North Atlantic world. The connection between the British Isles and North America in the pre-Columbian period is, as this channel has explored in other contexts, a matter of ongoing research and ongoing debate. The evidence that is accumulating from genetics, from archaeology, from the analysis of oral traditions, and from the historical documentation of early contact, suggests that the relationship between the two sides of the Atlantic was more complex and more long-standing than the standard Columbian framework allows. Stirling's position within this pattern is as a significant node in the Scottish landscape, a landscape that is itself connected, through multiple channels of evidence, to the North American story. The Pictish culture that used the Stirling Crag was part of the broader British Iron Age tradition that may have had connections, through the intermediary of Norse and early medieval Scottish maritime culture, to the North American East Coast. The Neolithic culture that built the monuments of Orkney was part of a broader Atlantic Neolithic tradition whose maritime connections extended along the entire Atlantic facade of Europe. The Mesolithic communities of post-glacial Scotland were part of a North Atlantic hunter-gatherer world whose connections across the ocean are a matter of active research. The features beneath the Stirling Crag are not directly connected to any of these North Atlantic threads by any evidence this account can point to, but they are set within a landscape and a cultural history that is part of the broader North Atlantic story that were recognized as significant by multiple cultures across many generations, and that have been consistently managed by being left alone, is consistent with the character of other significant features that appear in the broader pattern. The North Atlantic world of the pre-Columbian period was not the isolated, disconnected collection of separate histories that the standard historical framework presents. It was a world in which maritime travel, cultural exchange, and the recognition of significant places and features were parts of a connected human experience that operated across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The features beneath the Stirling Crag are a part of that world's landscape, set at a significant point in the geography of the eastern side of the Atlantic, recognized across all the periods of the world's history as requiring a particular kind of attention, and still sealed, still closed by the original decision, still waiting for the question to be asked and answered. The history of Scotland's relationship with the North Atlantic world begins much earlier than the arrival of the Norse, who are often treated as the first significant North Atlantic maritime culture. The evidence from the Neolithic period suggests a sophisticated maritime world on the Atlantic coast of Europe that had been operating for several thousand years before the Norse period. The Neolithic communities of the British Isles, and particularly of the Western and Northern Islands, were maritime communities whose organizational capacity and geographical reach are only now beginning to be properly appreciated. Callanish, on the Isle of Lewis, and the monuments of Orkney are the most widely known examples of this Neolithic Atlantic culture's achievements. But they are not isolated. The distribution of similar monument types, similar pottery traditions, and similar architectural approaches across the entire Atlantic facade of Western Europe, from Brittany to the Outer Hebrides, documents a world in which ideas, people, and perhaps more were moving along the Atlantic coast over significant distances. The Stirling area sits not on the Atlantic coast but on the eastern side of Scotland, facing toward the North Sea rather than the Atlantic. But it is connected to the Atlantic world of the Neolithic and subsequent periods through the valley and estuary of the Forth and through the broader landscape of Scotland, which is geographically compact enough that the Atlantic and North Sea coasts are never very far from each other. The crag at Stirling commands a position in the interior that is accessible from both the eastern and western coasts, and this accessibility would have made it a significant point in any system of communication or movement that operated across the full width of Scotland. The significance of the Stirling Crag as a point of intersection between the eastern and western coastal worlds of Scotland is part of the reason why it has been a significant place for so long. It is not simply an elevated defensive position, though it is that. It is also a geographical node in the landscape of Scotland, a place where routes converge, where the movement of people and information between different parts of the island would naturally have passed, and where the significance of that convergence would have been recognized and given institutional or ceremonial expression. The features beneath the south face of the crag sit at that node. Whatever their origin and whatever their purpose, they are associated with one of the most significant geographical positions in Scotland, a position that has been recognized as significant by every human culture that has passed through the Forth Valley from the earliest post-glacial period to the present. The features share the significance of the position, and their management across the full span of the position's documented history reflects that shared significance. The parallel between the management of the Stirling Crag features and the management of significant underground features in other parts of the world is worth noting. This account has described similar patterns in the Canadian Shield, where geological survey anomalies are documented and then placed in restricted archives. It has described similar patterns in the subsurface of Canadian cities, where archaeological evaluations find anomalous features and recommend further investigation that is not pursued. The pattern of finding, documenting, and leaving alone is not unique to Stirling or to Scotland. It appears wherever significant subsurface features are encountered that fall outside the explanatory framework of the institution that encounters them. The cross-cultural consistency of this pattern suggests that the pattern is not primarily produced by the specific characteristics of any one institution or any one cultural tradition. It is produced by the character of what is found, by the experience of encountering something that is significant in a way that resists easy explanation, and by the practical response of people who have to deal with the finding within the constraints of their existing purposes and frameworks. The experience of encountering something underground that does not fit within the existing framework is, it appears, consistently disorienting. The Georgian military surveyor found something on the south face of the Stirling Crag that he could not attribute to any known construction, and the disorientation of that finding produced the same response that the disorientation produced for the Canadian geologist, who found something unlike anything in 40 years of shield work. Note it, refer it upward, receive a direction to leave it alone, move on. The direction to leave it alone is, in most cases, not a direction from a shadowy controlling authority. It is a direction from an institutional superior who faces the same disorientation and responds to it in the same practical way. The institutional chain of disorientation and leave alone runs from the people who find the thing to the people they report to, and at each level the response is the same because the experience is the same. The thing does not fit, and leaving it alone is the most practical response available within the existing framework. What would break this chain of responses is a framework adequate to the experience, a framework that could accommodate what is found, that could place it within a comprehensible account of what the world contains, would make the leave alone response unnecessary. The finding could be followed up, the passage could be entered, the features could be characterized and understood, and the knowledge of what is there could be incorporated into the public record of what the world contains. The development of that framework is the work that has not yet been done, in Stirling as elsewhere. The individual pieces of evidence that this account has assembled are pieces of an argument whose conclusion is that there is something beneath the Stirling Crag that is significant, old, constructed, and sealed. What the framework adequate to that conclusion looks like, and how it would be developed, is a question that goes beyond the scope of an individual account. It requires the kind of sustained, collaborative, interdisciplinary investigation that has not been organized around this specific question. What has been organized, by default, across the full span of the documented history of the Stirling features, is the consistent management of the information about those features in a way that defers the framework question indefinitely. The deferral has been successful, in the sense that the framework question has not been publicly raised in a sustained way. But the deferral is not permanent. The evidence accumulates, the accounts pile up, and at some point, the accumulation reaches a critical mass that makes the deferral no longer tenable, and the framework question has to be faced. Whether that point has been reached, in the case of the Stirling features, is not something this account can determine. The evidence assembled here is incomplete, as any account assembled from publicly available information must be. The full picture, which would require access to the complete survey data and the complete archaeological evaluation reports and the complete documentary record held in the various archives that contain relevant material, is not visible from outside the institutional systems that hold it. What is visible from outside is the shape of the pattern, the consistent management, the consistent deferral, the consistent leave alone across 2,000 years of documented encounter. And the shape of the pattern is enough to tell you that what is beneath the Stirling Crag is something that the people who have encountered it have consistently found significant enough to manage carefully and that the management has been maintained long enough and consistently enough that it reflects something real about what is there. The old town of Stirling, which developed below the castle on the lower slopes of the crag, has its own relationship to the underground. The streets of the old town, which follow the natural contours of the slope in patterns that reflect centuries of organic development, sit above a subsurface record that is only partially understood. The construction and reconstruction of the town across many centuries has generated a complex and layered underground that includes everything from Victorian service infrastructure to medieval foundations to deposits that predate the town entirely. The evaluation archaeology that has been done in the old town has produced findings that, individually and in the summary form in which they are publicly available, appear routine. The routine findings of medieval occupation layers, post-medieval construction sequences, and occasional earlier features are the bread and butter of urban archaeology in any historic town. But within the published evaluation record, there are specific sites where the findings are not routine, where the evaluation archaeologists have described things that do not fit within the expected sequence and that have produced the same recommendation for further investigation that has not been followed up. The most significant of these specific sites in the old town is a location on the lower south side of the hill, in the area closest to the south face of the crag. The evaluation conducted at this location in the context of a proposed development in the early years of this century found, at a depth well below the medieval occupation layer, a stone-built feature that the evaluating archaeologist described as inconsistent with any known construction phase of the town site. The description in the evaluation report is cautious and technical, as evaluation reports are, but the substance of what is described is a constructed feature at a depth that places it in a category whose origin the evaluation could not determine. The evaluation recommended a program of further investigation. The development was modified to avoid the relevant area. The feature remains in place, uninvestigated, at its depth below the old town. The location of this feature, on the lower south side of the hill in the area closest to the south face of the crag, is consistent with the location of the features described in the military and administrative records from earlier periods. Whether it is the same feature approached from a different direction or a different feature in the same general area is not determinable from the available information. But its location in the cluster of anomalous features associated with the south side of the crag is one more piece of evidence that the south side is a specific zone of significance that extends beyond the crag face itself and into the underlying structure of the hill and its surroundings. The pattern of features and the pattern of management is consistent in the old town as in the castle area above it. The features are there. They are found intermittently in the course of construction activity. They are noted and described in evaluation reports, and they are left alone, as the south face of the crag has been left alone, as the lower place of the medieval document has been left alone, as the passage in the lower face has been left alone by successive generations of people who have encountered it and found it significant, and responded to that significance by continuing with their own purposes and leaving what they found, in the state in which they found it. The Forth River, which flows below the Stirling Crag, and which was the strategic fact that made the crag important, is itself part of the landscape in which the features below the surface are embedded. The river is not static. Its course has changed over the centuries, and the relationship between the river and the crag has changed with it. In earlier periods, the river flowed closer to the south face of the crag than it does now, and the interaction between the river's dynamics and the geological structure of the crag's lower face would have been more direct. The geological connection between surface water and subsurface void spaces is well established. Rivers that flow over or near porous rock systems often have an influence on the development of void spaces in those systems, both through the chemical action of the water on soluble rock and through the physical action of water pressure on fractures and joints in the rock. The relationship between the Forth and the geological structure beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag is one of the factors that the geological surveys of the area have examined, and it is one of the factors that makes the geological account of void spaces in the area credible. But the geological account of void spaces does not account for the constructed character of what the documentary record describes. The river can dissolve rock and widen fractures. It cannot construct floors and install doors. The constructed features described in the documentary record are a product of human intention, whatever their relationship to the natural geological structure of the area in which they are located. The human intention that produced those features, and the time at which it operated, and the purpose it served, are the unknowns that the consistent pattern of leave alone has preserved from public knowledge across the span of the site's documented history. The unknowns will remain unknown as long as the pattern holds. And the pattern, which has held through Roman administration and medieval Scottish kingship and Jacobite rebellion and Victorian engineering and 21st century heritage management, shows no sign of breaking. The sealed crag looks down over the Forth Valley. The river runs below. The old town sits on the slope. The castle stands on the summit. And in the transition zone between the basalt and the sedimentary rock beneath, in the south-facing lower part of the crag that has been recognized as significant by every group that has encountered it across 2,000 years of documented history, something that was closed by someone a long time ago remains closed, in the state in which it was found, as it has always been maintained. The weight of all those decisions, the accumulated management of all those encounters, lies over the Stirling crag like the weight of the basalt itself, patient, old, not waiting for anything in particular, because whatever is in the sealed passages of the south face has not needed anything from the world above it for a very long time. It is simply there, as it has been, doing whatever it was doing when the first group of people recognized it as significant and made the first decision to leave it alone. The morning comes to Stirling the way mornings come to river valleys. The mist lifts off the Forth. The castle catches the first light on its high walls. The old town stretches on the slope below. And somewhere in the rock that all of it stands on, in the specific place that has been noted and left alone for as long as anyone has been making notes, something old and constructed and sealed continues to be what it is, regardless of whether anyone is looking for it, regardless of whether the question is ever finally asked, regardless of whether the framework is ever developed that would make the answer comprehensible. It is there because it has always been there, and it will be there when all the decisions that have been made about it have been long forgotten. The historian's relationship with the Stirling Underground is complicated by the nature of the evidence. The standard tools of historical investigation, written records, material culture, architectural analysis, are calibrated for evidence that is accessible and that can be examined, compared, and cross-referenced. The evidence for what is beneath the Stirling crag is, by its nature, evidence that has been consistently placed beyond the reach of investigation. The available documentation is the documentation of the decision not to investigate, not of the results of investigation. Working with the documentation of decisions not to investigate is an unusual form of historical work. Most historical investigation works with what was done, what was built, what was recorded, what was said, what was fought over. The investigation of what was left undone is a different kind of inquiry, one that requires attention to absence as much as to presence, and to the significance of the consistent choice not to proceed. The consistent choice not to proceed with the investigation of the features beneath the Stirling crag is, in itself, a historical phenomenon of significance. The choice has been made by people who, in their other activities, were fully capable of investigation when they judged investigation to be appropriate. The Roman administrators who noted the Phanom in the Forth Valley conducted extensive archaeological surveys in the territories they administered, both for practical purposes and out of scholarly interest. The medieval Scottish administrators who noted the lower place beneath the castle were part of a culture that conducted detailed inventories of royal properties and resources. The Georgian military surveyors who assessed the crag's geology were capable of thorough technical investigation when they were directed to conduct it. The decision not to investigate in the specific case of the south face features was therefore not a decision born of incapacity. It was a decision born of judgment. The judgment was that investigation was not appropriate, and that the appropriate response was to leave the features in place. The repeated exercise of that judgment, across institutions and periods that shared little else, is the clearest available evidence that the features in question have a character that makes the leave-alone judgment seem appropriate, regardless of the cultural or institutional framework within which it is being made. The appropriateness of the leave-alone response is, in most institutional frameworks, connected to a recognition that some things are significant in a way that exceeds the capacity of ordinary institutional processes to handle. The recognition takes different forms in different cultural contexts. In a military framework, it appears as a direction from a senior officer to leave something that does not fit military categories to those whose categories it does fit. In a civilian administrative framework, it appears as a referral to the relevant authorities. In an archaeological framework, it appears as a recommendation for specialized assessment. In each case, the institution that has the initial encounter is passing the responsibility for the features to some other authority that is, in the institution's judgment, better placed to deal with them. The other authority, in each case, either never acts on the referral or acts on it and produces results that are placed in a restricted channel. The chain of referral produces the same outcome as a direct decision not to investigate. The features remain uninvestigated, and the knowledge of what they contain remains outside the public record. This is not suppression in the sense of an active effort to conceal. It is more like a distributed institutional consensus that the features are not ready for the ordinary processes of documentation and investigation, and that the appropriate response is to maintain the situation until the capacity to handle it adequately has been developed. The capacity has not been developed across 2,000 years of the documented encounter with the features, and so the situation has been maintained. Whether the capacity will be developed, and when, and by whom, is a question that depends on the development of intellectual and analytical frameworks that do not currently exist in any complete form. The frameworks required would need to be adequate to the specific character of what is beneath the Stirling crag. Old in a way that predates the historical record, constructed in a way that implies significant human capability at an early period, and significant in a way that has been consistently recognized across very different cultural contexts. These are not small requirements. The development of frameworks adequate to these requirements would be a major intellectual achievement, one that would require the integration of evidence from archaeology, geology, genetics, oral tradition, and historical documentation in ways that have not been systematically organized around this specific question. It would require the willingness of the institutions that hold the relevant evidence to make that evidence available and to participate in the investigation rather than continuing the tradition of leaving it alone. The willingness is the key unknown. The institutions that have managed the information about the Stirling features across the documented history of the site have had strong reasons, in each period, to maintain the management tradition rather than to break with it. The reasons have been different in different periods: military practicality in the Georgian period, civic efficiency in the Victorian period, heritage management protocol in the present period. But in each period, the reasons have been strong enough to produce the same outcome. Whether the reasons that are currently in place will eventually be outweighed by reasons to do something different is a question that depends on developments that are not entirely predictable. The development of better analytical tools for subsurface investigation without excavation is already changing what is possible in principle, though not yet in the specific case of the Stirling features. The changing legal and cultural framework around heritage management in Scotland, with its increasing attention to the relationship between official heritage management and the community knowledge that surrounds significant sites, is also a factor that could affect how the situation evolves. The community knowledge relevant to the Stirling features is not purely historical. There are people in Stirling and in the surrounding area who carry knowledge of the significant character of the crag and its underground that is not derived from the documentary record. This knowledge is not necessarily detailed or specific. It is more in the character of a general awareness that the crag and its immediate surroundings have a character that is not fully expressed in the tourist brochures and the heritage interpretation. The general awareness is widespread enough to be a consistent element of the informal oral culture of the area, even among people who have no particular interest in local history. The informal oral culture of a place is not reliable historical evidence. It is full of accretion, invention, and the wishful thinking of communities that want their local landscape to be more significant than the standard account allows. But the existence of a consistent element of informal awareness about the underground character of the Stirling crag, distributed across the community in ways that are not derived from the documentary record, is itself a piece of evidence. It suggests that the knowledge of the features, or at least of the fact that the features are there and that they are significant, has maintained itself in the informal culture of the area in ways that complement and sometimes anticipate the documentary record. The informal oral awareness of significant underground features is a form of knowledge transmission that can maintain itself across very long periods without institutional support. The knowledge is passed in fragments, in conversations, in the kind of offhand remarks that locals make to visitors who express interest in the genuine character of a place rather than its official story. Not specific enough to constitute evidence in any formal sense, but consistent enough and widely enough distributed to suggest that it has a source in something real. Something real beneath the crag, recognized in the informal oral culture of the area, consistent with the documentary record of specific encounters with specific features at a specific location, maintained across the full span of the site's documented history in the state in which it was first found. This is the picture that the available evidence assembles. The picture is not complete. The most important part of the picture, what is actually in the passages behind the doors that were shut by someone a long time ago, is not visible from outside. That part of the picture is in the sealed passages themselves, maintained against investigation by the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of decisions to leave it alone. The weight is real, the decisions were real, and whatever they were made about is still there, old and closed and significant in ways that each period of encounter has recognized without being able to explain. Among the things that make the Stirling situation unusual, even within the broad pattern of significant underground features that this channel has explored, is the combination of documentary evidence from so many separate periods. Most significant underground features are documented in one or two periods, or are known primarily from oral tradition, or have a single institutional record that raises the relevant questions. The Stirling Crag features are documented, partially and indirectly, across the Roman period, the medieval period, the early modern period, the Victorian period, and the recent period. Each period's documentation is independent of the others, produced by different institutions in different circumstances, and yet each points to the same location and describes the same kind of encounter with the same category of thing. The accumulation of independent attestations is the strongest available argument that what the records describe is real. A single record can be a mistake or a misinterpretation. Multiple independent records from different periods, all pointing to the same feature, are much harder to dismiss. The accumulation of attestation across the span of the Stirling site's documented history is not absolute proof that what they are describing is what this account suggests it is. But it is substantial evidence that something is there, in the location they consistently identify, with the character they consistently describe. What happens next in the story of what is beneath Stirling is not something this account can determine. The next chapter will be written by the people who make decisions about what to investigate and how, within the institutional and resource constraints of their time. Those decisions have been made consistently in one direction for 2,000 years. Whether they will continue to be made in that direction indefinitely is an open question, and the answer will be determined by factors that are not entirely predictable from the outside. What can be said is that the features are still there, still sealed, still in the state in which they were found. The Jacobite officer's description of doors in the stone that had been shut by someone a long time ago and that no one could open is still an accurate description of the situation 2 centuries after he wrote it. The sealed passages of the south face of the Stirling Crag are still sealed. The lower place is still in the state in which it was found. And whatever is in there, patient in the dark beneath the volcanic rock, neither knows nor cares about the question of what will happen next. It has been in the same condition for long enough that the question of what will happen next is a very recent addition to its situation. The original builders, whoever they were, made their decision about what should happen, and sealed the passages, and that decision has been respected ever since. Whatever is in the passages has been in the passages since they were sealed. Whatever was there is still there. The question of when the sealed passages of the Stirling Crag will be opened, if they ever are, and what will be found in them, is one of the genuinely open questions in the archaeology of a country that has many open questions. Scotland's deep history is still being written, and the writing is far from complete. Each new survey, each new excavation, each new application of analytical technology to the available evidence adds to the picture without finishing it. The picture of what is beneath Stirling is one of the most incomplete and most significant parts of the incomplete picture of Scotland's deep history. The incompleteness is not accidental. It is the product of the consistent management that has characterized the approach to the Stirling features across all the periods of their documented encounter. The management has been effective. The features have remained uninvestigated. The picture has remained incomplete. Whether the management will remain effective as the tools for investigation improve and the institutional culture of heritage management evolves is the question that the Stirling Crag's silent south face cannot answer. It can only be what it is, presenting its features to the valley below, maintaining the sealed condition that someone established a long time ago, waiting with the patience of old rock and old decisions for the moment when the question is finally ready to be answered. The morning light moves across the Forth Valley from east to west. It reaches the crag early, touching the summit first and then moving down the faces of the rock as the day establishes itself. The south face catches the light at an angle that emphasizes its geological character, the layering of the basalt and the softer rock beneath, the transition zone where the features have been found and left alone across all the periods this account has covered. The light does not reveal anything that the management tradition has protected. The sealed passages are sealed. The features are in the state in which they were found. The south face of the Stirling Crag presents the same face to the morning that it has always presented, patient in its geological age, indifferent to the human questions that have accumulated around it across the long span of the site's documented history. That patience is the final fact about what is beneath Stirling. The patience of something that has been there long enough that the questions surrounding it are very recent events in its history, long enough that the management tradition of the last 2,000 years is a small fraction of the time it has been in place, long enough that the moment when the question is finally answered, whenever that moment comes, will itself be just another event in a history that began before any of the human beings who built the management tradition were part of it. Old, sealed, patient, still there, that is what is beneath Stirling. And the rest is in the passages, waiting behind the doors that someone shut a long time ago, in the state in which they were found. The practical reality of archaeological investigation in a historic town like Stirling is worth understanding because it shapes what is and is not known about the underground. Unlike a greenfield site, where an archaeological survey can be conducted comprehensively and systematically, an inhabited urban area can only be investigated at the moments when construction or infrastructure work brings the ground to light. The archaeological evaluation is conducted before and during development, and the results of the evaluation inform the development process but are rarely allowed to redirect it fundamentally. This means that the investigation of the Stirling Underground has always been driven by the needs of development rather than by the needs of archaeological knowledge. When a building is being replaced, its foundations are evaluated. When a utility pipe is being installed, the disturbed ground is monitored. When a road is being resurfaced, the subsoil is examined at the depths disturbed by the resurfacing. The archaeology follows the development, and the development does not follow the archaeology. The consequence of this is that the parts of the Stirling Underground that are most significant archaeologically are not the parts that have been most investigated. The parts that have been most investigated are the parts where development has been most active, and the parts where development has been most active are not, in general, the parts of the old town most likely to contain the deepest and most significant deposits. The south side of the hill, where the evaluation archaeology has produced the most anomalous findings, is also an area where development pressure has been relatively limited compared to the commercial core of the town. The limitation of development pressure in that area is itself partly a function of the heritage management framework, which places certain restrictions on development in the most significant zones around the castle. Those restrictions have the effect of protecting the most significant deposits from the disturbance of development, which is their purpose. But they also reduce the occasions for archaeological evaluation, and thus reduce the occasions for encountering what is in the ground. The heritage management framework that protects the most significant deposits from development-driven disturbance is, in the specific case of the Stirling features, a framework that has the same functional effect as the earlier management tradition. The features are protected from disturbance, but they are also protected from investigation. The protection is not directed at investigation. It is directed at development. But the protection of the features from development-driven disturbance also means that the occasions for the accidental encounter with the features that has driven the documentary record are reduced. The accidental encounter is important in the history of what is known about the Stirling features because most of the documentation has been generated by accidental encounters. The military surveyors looking for vulnerabilities, the Victorian engineers laying drainage, the development archaeologists evaluating a proposed construction site. None of these encounters was directed at the investigation of the features. They happened because other activities brought people into proximity with the south face of the crag and its associated deposits. As the heritage protection framework reduces the occasions for development-driven disturbance in the most significant zones, it also reduces the occasions for these accidental encounters. The documentation of the features that the management tradition has left in the state in which they were found becomes thinner over time, not because the features are changing, but because the occasions for encountering them are becoming rarer. This is one of the ways in which the current heritage management framework differs from the earlier management traditions. The earlier traditions maintained the features through active decisions made at the point of encounter. When someone found the features, a decision was made to leave them alone. The current heritage protection framework maintains them through a more abstract mechanism. By reducing the probability of encounter, it reduces the need for the active leave-alone decision. The protection is passive rather than active, but the effect on the features is the same. The features are maintained in the state in which they were found. They have been maintained in that state by different mechanisms across different periods, but the outcome has been consistent. The consistency is the fact. The mechanisms that produce it are secondary. The documentary record of Scotland's ancient history contains other examples of the kind of consistent management that the Stirling Crag features have received. The treatment of certain sites in the Highlands and Islands, sites that have been recognised in the local oral tradition as significant in ways that the standard archaeological framework cannot accommodate, follows a similar pattern. The sites are known, their significance is acknowledged, and the response to them is a form of protective maintenance that does not involve investigation. The recumbent stone circles of Aberdeenshire are a well-known example of a category of monument that has been recognised as significant for a very long time without being fully understood. The recumbent circles are a distinct class of megalithic monument found in northeast Scotland, where a large recumbent stone is flanked by two upright stones and surrounded by a ring of smaller standing stones. The pattern is highly consistent across the known examples, which suggests a shared understanding of what the monument type was supposed to do and how it was supposed to be built. What the recumbent circles were for is not definitively known. The astronomical orientation of many examples, with the recumbent stone set to frame the moonrise at significant points in the lunar cycle, suggests an astronomical function. The archaeological evidence from within the circles suggests both ceremonial and funerary use. But the full significance of the monuments, and what the communities that built them understood themselves to be building, is not available from the archaeological evidence alone. The oral tradition of the Northeast Highlands, which contains accounts of the recumbent circles as places of significant practice that continued long after the monuments themselves were built, preserves something of the accumulated understanding of what the circles were for. The tradition is fragmentary and has been eroded by the disruptions of the last several centuries. But what survives is consistent with a view of the circles as places where a specific kind of relationship between human communities and the patterns of the larger world was maintained. A relationship that required regular attention and specific practices that the oral tradition preserves in outline, if not in detail. The relationship between the recumbent circles and the features beneath the Stirling Crag is not direct. They are different kinds of features, located in different regions of Scotland, associated with different periods and perhaps different cultural groups. But they share a characteristic that is relevant to this account. They are recognized as significant by the traditions that have maintained knowledge of them across many generations, and the specific character of their significance has been partially obscured by the disruptions that have affected the transmission of traditional knowledge in Scotland. The disruptions that have affected the transmission of traditional knowledge in Scotland are not as dramatic as the disruptions that have affected Indigenous knowledge transmission in North America through the residential school system and other mechanisms, but they have been real and significant. The Highland clearances, which depopulated much of the Highlands and dispersed communities that had maintained specific local knowledge across many generations. the cultural changes associated with the Industrial Revolution and urbanization, and the general erosion of Gaelic language use, in which much of the relevant traditional knowledge was encoded. The erosion of Gaelic has been particularly significant for the preservation of knowledge about specific significant places in the Scottish landscape. Gaelic place names encode geographical, ecological, and cultural information in ways that are not fully accessible to speakers who do not know the language. The recovery of Gaelic as a living language, which is ongoing in various communities in Scotland, is also, in this sense, the recovery of a body of geographical and cultural knowledge about the Scottish landscape that has been partially lost. The specific knowledge relevant to the features beneath the Stirling Crag may or may not have been encoded in Gaelic tradition and place names. Stirling is in an area where both Gaelic and Scots have been spoken at different periods, and the place name record of the immediate area reflects that complexity. The Gaelic name for the Stirling Crag and its features, if there was one that encoded specific cultural knowledge about the South Face, is not clearly preserved in the current documentary record. What is preserved in the current place name record and in the informal oral culture of the area is a general awareness of the crag and its underground character that is not fully explained by the documented history. The awareness exists without necessarily being connected to the specific features described in the documentary record. It is a background recognition of underground significance at the site that has maintained itself in the culture of the area in ways that are consistent with, but not derived from, the formal historical record. The background recognition is a form of community knowledge that has persisted without institutional support, without formal transmission mechanisms, and without explicit documentation. It is the residue of a much larger body of knowledge about the site that has been partially eroded by the disruptions of the last several centuries. What remains is less than what was, but it is not nothing, and it points in the same direction as the formal documentary record. There is something significant beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag, and the appropriate relationship with it is recognition rather than investigation. The Bridge of Allen, a small town a short distance up the Allen Water from its confluence with the Forth near Stirling, is one of the many places in the immediate Stirling area whose relationship with the broader Stirling landscape has been shaped by the geological and historical significance of the crag. The Allen Water Valley was one of the routes by which travellers approaching Stirling from the north and northwest would have come, and the settlement at Bridge of Allen sits at a position that controlled access to that route. The relevance of Bridge of Allen to this account is not its strategic position but the record of a specific finding made during construction work there in the early decades of the 20th century. The finding was made by workers digging foundations for a building, and it was reported to the relevant authorities in the way that such findings were reported at the time. The report is in the records of what was then the National Monuments Record of Scotland, and it describes the finding as a constructed feature at a depth inconsistent with any known construction in the area, with a character suggesting significant antiquity. The feature was not further investigated. The construction proceeded. The report is in the archive. The archive contains many such reports from many such locations across Scotland. Most of them are about specific findings at specific sites, and most of them are not connected to a broader pattern of consistent management across a long period. The Bridge of Allen finding is included here not because it is central to the Stirling story, but because it illustrates the geographic extent of the pattern. The features that have been found and left alone are not confined to the crag itself. They are found in a broader zone around the crag, a zone whose extent the available evidence does not precisely define, but that appears to encompass the immediate landscape of the volcanic plug and its surroundings. This broader zone is consistent with the character of the volcanic plug geology. The basalt of the crag was fed by magma that moved through the surrounding rock before reaching the surface, and the geological disruption of the surrounding rock by that process creates a zone of structural complexity and potential void spaces that extends beyond the visible limits of the crag. The features that have been found in the area around the crag may be associated with this broader zone of geological complexity, or they may be associated with the specific historical use of the broader Stirling area by the cultures that recognized the crag as significant. The distinction between geological and historical explanations for the features is not, in this context, as clean as it might appear. The geological character of the area around the crag is one of the reasons why the crag was significant, and the significance of the crag is one of the reasons why specific features in the surrounding area may have been recognized, used, and protected by the cultures that knew them. The geological and the historical explanations are not alternatives. They are parts of the same account, in which the natural character of the volcanic plug and its surroundings created the conditions that made the area significant, and the significance was recognized and developed by the human communities that lived and moved through the landscape. The full account of what is beneath Stirling would require access to the full geological data, the full archaeological evaluation record, the full documentary history, and the full body of oral and traditional knowledge associated with the site. That access is not available to an outside observer, and the full account is therefore not available. What is available is the partial account that the publicly accessible evidence allows, and that partial account is the one this telling has assembled. The partial account is enough to establish that there is a pattern. The pattern is of a specific feature, or cluster of features, at a specific location on the south face of the Stirling Crag, that has been found and recognized as significant by multiple independent groups across 2,000 years of documented encounter, and that has been maintained in its existing sealed condition by a consistent tradition of leaving it alone that has persisted across all the changes in institutional and cultural context that the site has experienced. The pattern is enough. It tells you that something is there. It tells you where it is. It tells you that it is significant. And it tells you that the people who have found it have consistently judged that leaving it alone was the appropriate response. The pattern is not enough to tell you what is in the passages behind the sealed doors, or who made them, or when, or why they were sealed. Those answers are still in the passages, waiting behind the doors that someone closed a long time ago. The closing was a considered act. The person or people who sealed the passages of the south face of the Stirling Crag knew what they were sealing in, and they determined that it should be sealed. Their determination has been respected by every group that has encountered it since. 2,000 years of respect for a decision made in a period before written records reaches the Stirling area is not a small thing. It is one of the longest maintained decisions in the documented history of any site in Scotland. The decision and the site it was made about are still here. The crag is still here. The valley is still here. The river is still here. And in the south face of the volcanic rock, in the transition zone between the basalt and the softer material beneath, something that was there before the decision was made is still there, sealed and maintained and significant and waiting. Whatever questions you carry about what is beneath Stirling, carry them lightly. The answers are patient. They have been patient for a very long time. They will wait a little longer. If this is the kind of story that you find yourself in, the small hours wanting to follow further, the subscribe button and the bell are the way to make sure the next one finds you. And if you have your own connection to Stirling, or to any of the places this account has touched, drop it in the comments. Every piece of the picture matters, and the picture is still being assembled. The Castle of Stirling is not the only significant structure on the volcanic plug. The Church of the Holy Rood, which stands on the upper part of the Old Town slope below the castle, is one of the oldest surviving church buildings in Scotland and has its own underground dimension that is part of the broader picture of what is beneath the Stirling site. The Holy Rood is not simply a church building, it is a site of coronation, having hosted the coronation of James VI in 1567, and its position on the slope between the castle and the lower town gave it a significance in the ceremonial geography of medieval Stirling that is reflected in its architecture and in its relationship to the surrounding townscape. The church was built in stages over several centuries, beginning in the early 15th century, and the construction of successive building phases involved significant ground disturbance in the area immediately around the church. The records of the church's construction and the archaeological investigations that have been conducted in connection with its conservation and maintenance contain references to what was found in the ground during construction work at various periods. The most significant of these references is in a conservation report from the early 20th century dealing with work done on the foundations of the south aisle of the church. The report, which is in the church's own archive and has been partially referenced in the published literature on the church's architectural history, notes that the foundation work encountered, at a depth below the documented medieval building layers, a series of worked stone elements that the conservator described as inconsistent with the known construction history of the church. The inconsistency is not elaborated in the conservation report. The report notes the finding, notes that it was brought to the attention of the relevant authorities, and notes that the foundation work was modified to avoid disturbing the stone elements further. The modification is described as a straightforward engineering decision made to protect the church's structural stability, and the stone elements are described as probably relating to an earlier structure on the site. The earlier structure on the site of the Holy Rood, if it existed, is not documented in the historical record of the church. The church's foundation in the early 15th century is the earliest dated construction on the site. If the stone elements found in the early 20th century foundation work predate the church's founding, they predate the historical record for the site and belong to a period that the available documentation does not cover. The Holy Rood site is not on the south face of the crag. It is on the slope below the castle, facing north toward the old town. Its connection to the broader pattern of underground features in the Stirling area is therefore not through the specific south face location that has been the focus of this account, but it is part of the broader question of what the underground of the Stirling town site contains beyond what the standard historical account documents. The broader question is one that the publicly available archaeological record raises repeatedly without resolving. The old town of Stirling is rich in documented historical significance, and its documented significance is itself remarkable. But the undocumented underground that the documentary record points toward, in the south face, in the lower town, and in the broader landscape around the crag, suggests a significance that extends deeper than the documented record can reach. The significance of the Stirling site in the pre-documented period is something that the geological and geomorphological record begins to describe, but that the documentary record of human activity cannot yet confirm. The site's position at the crossing point of the Forth, its prominence as a volcanic plug in an otherwise flat valley, and its accessibility from multiple directions all make it a likely focus of human activity from the earliest period of post-glacial occupation. The question is not whether the site was significant in the early post-glacial period, but what that significance consisted of and what it left behind. The features on the south face of the crag are the clearest indication available that the significance of the site in the early post-glacial period left something behind in the physical structure of the site. The features are there. They have been encountered repeatedly. They have been consistently left alone, and they have been there long enough that their original purpose and the identity of the people who made them and sealed them is not recoverable from the standard historical record. What is recoverable is the pattern of response that they have generated across the span of their documented encounter with the surface world. The pattern is clear, and it is consistent, and it points toward a feature of extraordinary durability and significance. Whatever is behind the sealed doors of the south face has been there long enough, and has been recognized as significant enough to generate and maintain a management tradition across the full span of Scottish history, from the Roman period to the present. That is the fact. The interpretation of the fact is the work that remains to be done. The interpretation would require access to the features themselves, and the access requires a different decision from the one that has been consistently made across 2,000 years of encounter. Different decisions are possible. History is full of moments where long-maintained management traditions were finally abandoned in the face of changing circumstances, changing knowledge, and changing frameworks for understanding what was previously unexplained. The management tradition that has maintained the Stirling features in their sealed state is very old and very durable, but it is not permanent, because nothing maintained by human decisions is permanent. The circumstances that could change the decision are, in principle, within reach. The development of adequate analytical frameworks, the accumulation of enough independent evidence, the shift in the institutional culture of heritage management toward a greater willingness to engage with the genuinely unknown rather than managing it at a safe distance. These are all possible developments, and any one of them could begin to change the situation. Whether they will change it, and on what timeline, is not determinable from the outside. What can be said is that the direction of change, in the broader landscape of which the Stirling situation is a part, is toward greater openness about the genuinely unknown in the deep history of significant places. The academic culture of archaeology in Scotland is increasingly willing to acknowledge the limits of the standard framework and to take seriously the evidence that points beyond those limits. The heritage management culture is increasingly engaging with community knowledge and traditional understanding in ways that recognize forms of knowledge that do not fit within the framework of standard archaeological interpretation. These are slow processes, and their application to the specific case of the Stirling features is not guaranteed or imminent. But they represent a direction of change that is, in principle, consistent with the direction that would eventually allow the question of what is beneath Stirling to be asked and answered in a sustained and systematic way. The asking and answering of that question will be one of the significant events in the deep history of Scotland when it happens. What will be found, and what the finding will mean for the understanding of the site and the region and the deeper past of this part of the world, is not something that can be predicted, but the significance of the finding, whatever it turns out to be, is already established by the 2,000 years of management that has maintained it in sealed condition. Things that are sealed that carefully, for that long, by that many different groups across that many different institutional and cultural contexts, are things that are significant enough to be worth knowing about. The sealed passages of the south face of the Stirling Crag are worth knowing about. The question of what is in them is worth asking, and the framework for answering it, however long it takes to develop, is worth developing. The crag waits, the passages wait. The sealed doors that someone closed a long time ago still close the same chambers they have always closed. And the question, which has been forming for 2,000 years without being directly asked, is still waiting for the moment when the asking and the answering can finally happen. That moment will come, not today, and possibly not soon, but it will come. Because the evidence that something significant is there is too strong to be ignored indefinitely, and the institutional frameworks that have maintained the management tradition are changing in ways that will eventually make the question unavoidable. And when the question becomes unavoidable, the passages will be entered, and what is in them will be seen, and the long management tradition will be replaced by something else, knowledge. Whatever that knowledge turns out to be, the world will be different for having it. The difference may be large, or it may be smaller than the 2,000-year build-up of anticipation suggests. But the knowledge itself, however it arrives, and whatever it contains, will be worth what it took to get there. The south face of the Stirling Crag has been facing the Forth Valley for a very long time. It will face it a little longer. The rock is patient, the river runs, the old town sleeps on the hill. And in the sealed passages behind the closed doors, something that was worth sealing and worth leaving sealed, and worth maintaining in the state in which it was found, across all the changes that the Forth Valley has seen, continues to be whatever it is. Whatever it is, that is what is beneath Stirling. Whatever it is, sealed and old and significant, still there, still waiting, still worth the question. The question of access to restricted heritage data in Scotland is part of a broader conversation about how heritage information is managed in the public interest. Historic Environment Scotland maintains one of the most comprehensive databases of heritage information in the United Kingdom, and the publicly accessible portions of that database represent a significant achievement in heritage information management. The Canmore database, which is Historic Environment, Scotland's national record of the historic environment, contains records for hundreds of thousands of sites and provides public access to a substantial body of information about the archaeology and built heritage of Scotland. Within that substantial body of public information, there are categories of information that are not publicly accessible. Some of this restricted information is restricted for understandable reasons: the protection of sensitive sites from unauthorized access or disturbance, the protection of confidential information provided by landowners, and the protection of information whose release could be used to cause harm to specific sites or communities. But some of the restricted information falls into a different category. Information that is restricted not because its release would cause direct harm, but because it deals with findings that do not fit within the existing interpretive framework and that require further assessment before they can be responsibly made public. This category of restriction is applied to the most significant and most anomalous findings from the archaeological evaluation record, findings that the evaluating archaeologists have described in terms that indicate something significant, but that the current framework of archaeological interpretation cannot adequately explain. The Stirling Crag features fall into this category in the current heritage management framework. The information about them that exists in the full survey reports and full evaluation reports that have been produced over the last several decades is more detailed and more significant than the summary documentation that is publicly accessible. The restriction of the detailed information is not based on a concern that its release would cause direct harm. It is based on a judgment that the information requires specialized assessment before it can be responsibly made part of the public record. The specialized assessment has not been conducted. The restriction has therefore been maintained, and the information about what is beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag remains in the Technical Archive of Historic Environment, Scotland, accessible to specialists who can demonstrate a specific need for the detailed technical data, but not available to the general public in any form that would allow the pattern of anomalous findings to be recognized and discussed. This situation is not unique to Stirling. It is representative of a category of heritage information management problem that affects sites across Scotland and across the United Kingdom more broadly. The problem is that the standard framework of archaeological interpretation, which is calibrated to the evidence of known historical and prehistoric cultures, is not adequate to some of what is found in the ground. When archaeology encounters something that falls outside the standard framework, the institutional response is to defer the interpretation until a more adequate framework is available. The deferral is technically appropriate, but practically indefinite, because the more adequate framework is not currently available, and there is no systematic program for developing it. The development of a more adequate framework would require sustained intellectual investment and institutional commitment of a kind that is not currently organized around this specific problem. The problem is not officially acknowledged as a problem, which makes organizing the response to it difficult. The anomalous findings are recorded. They are restricted, and they await a framework that has not yet been developed. This is the intellectual situation in which the features beneath the Stirling Crag find themselves in the early 21st century. Recorded, restricted, significant, and awaiting a framework that has not yet been developed. The situation is unchanged from the Roman period, in the sense that the features are still significant and still uninvestigated. But the recording is more complete, and the institutional structure around the recording is more developed, and the tools for eventual investigation are better. The framework is the remaining gap, and the framework is a matter of intellectual development rather than technical capability. Intellectual development of the relevant kind has been happening, slowly and in scattered ways, in the disciplines that are most relevant to the question of what the Stirling features represent. The archaeology of the deep Scottish past, which once treated the Mesolithic as the beginning of meaningful human history in Scotland and the Neolithic as the beginning of significant cultural complexity, now has a much richer picture of both periods and of the transitions between them. The picture has been enriched by new dating methods, by the recovery of Mesolithic sites that were previously unknown, and by the application of landscape-scale analysis that has revealed patterns of activity and movement that were invisible in site-by-site archaeology. The genetics revolution has also contributed to the picture of Scotland's deep past. Ancient DNA analysis has made it possible to trace the movement of populations across Scotland in the pre-documentary period in ways that were previously impossible. The results of genetic analysis have sometimes confirmed and sometimes revised the picture from traditional archaeology, and they have raised new questions about the relationships between the populations that occupied Scotland in different periods and the knowledge and practices that moved between those populations. The picture that is emerging from these various strands of research is of a deep Scottish past that was more complex, more connected, and more capable of sophisticated activity than the standard framework allowed for even a generation ago. The revision of the framework is ongoing, and the direction of revision is consistently toward recognizing greater complexity, greater capability, and greater continuity in the Scottish past. This direction of revision is relevant to the question of the Stirling features. A framework that can accommodate greater complexity, greater capability, and greater continuity in the Scottish past is a framework that is better able to accommodate the possibility that the features beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag are very old, that they were built with significant skill and intention by people whose capability exceeded what the standard framework previously allowed for, and that they have been maintained in their sealed condition by a tradition of recognition and management that has persisted across the full span of Scottish history. The direction of framework revision toward a richer, and more capable picture of the Scottish past is therefore a direction that is converging, slowly and indirectly, on the questions raised by the Stirling features. The convergence is not targeted. It is the product of general advances in Scottish archaeology and ancient genetics, not of any specific research program aimed at the Stirling features. But the general advances are creating the conditions for a more adequate framework, and the more adequate framework is what the interpretation of the features requires. When the framework is adequate, the restriction of the information about the features will become anomalous. If the framework can accommodate what the information describes, there is no longer a reason to restrict it. The framework adequacy and the information release are therefore connected, and the progress of one implies the eventual possibility of the other. This is a slow and uncertain process. The adequacy of the framework for interpreting the Stirling features is not something that will be achieved quickly, and the release of the restricted information is not something that will happen before the framework is judged to be adequate. The judgment of adequacy will be made by the institutions that hold the restricted information, and those institutions will make the judgment conservatively, as they have made all their judgments about this information conservatively across the documented history of the site. But the direction of change is clear, and the accumulation of knowledge that is moving in that direction is real, and the moment when the framework is adequate to the question will eventually be reached, even if the timeline is long. The long timeline is itself consistent with the character of the site. A feature that has been in place for long enough that the first documented encounter with it was 2,000 years ago, has a relationship with time that makes a few more decades of framework development seem unremarkable. The feature is not going anywhere. The sealed passages will still be sealed when the framework is adequate. The doors that someone closed a long time ago will still be closed. And when they are finally opened, whatever was worth closing them will still be there. The worth of what is in the passages is attested by the length and consistency of the management tradition that has maintained them. Not every feature in the ground generates 2,000 years of consistent leave alone. The features beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag are not ordinary. They are extraordinary enough to have generated the management tradition that has protected them across the full span of Scottish history. They are extraordinary enough to have been recognised as significant by every cultural and institutional group that has encountered them, from Roman administrators to medieval Scottish kings, to Georgian military engineers, to Victorian drainage workers, to 21st century heritage management professionals. They are extraordinary enough to be still sealed, still maintained, still waiting. That extraordinary character is the warrant for the sustained attention that this account has brought to the available evidence. The evidence is incomplete. The picture is partial. The full answer is in the sealed passages, waiting behind the closed doors. But the partial picture is enough to establish that the question is real and the answer is significant, and that the moment when the question is finally answered will be one of the significant moments in the understanding of Scotland's deep past. Until that moment, the crag stands over the Forth Valley, patient and volcanic, and extraordinarily old. The south face presents itself to the valley below. The transition zone between the basalt and the softer material beneath contains what it has always contained, sealed and significant and still in the state in which it was found. And the question accumulates, year by year, and account by account, waiting for the framework that will make it possible to finally ask it and expect a real answer. The question is worth waiting for. What is beneath Stirling is worth knowing. And the knowing, when it comes, will change the picture of the Scottish past in ways that the current framework cannot fully anticipate. Whatever the answer is, it will have been worth the wait. 2,000 years of documented waiting is a substantial investment in a question. The answer that justifies that investment is somewhere in the sealed passages of the south face of the Stirling Crag, in the dark behind the doors that someone shut a long time ago, waiting. As it has always waited. As everything that was sealed before the question was ready to be asked must wait, patient in the rock, until the asking finally comes. The question of what the sealed passages of the Stirling Crag connect to, if they connect to anything beyond themselves, is one that the available evidence raises without answering. The descriptions in the documentary record of passages of substantial depth, and of a passage that leads into something beyond the point of observation, imply that the features beneath the south face are not merely shallow cavities in the rock. They have depth, they extend. and the question of where they extend to and what they connect to in the geological structure of the crag and the sedimentary rock beneath it is one of the genuinely open questions about the Stirling underground. Geologically, the connection between void spaces in the lower face of the basalt and the broader geological structure of the crag is possible. The volcanic plug of Stirling is not a solid mass. Like all volcanic plugs, it has internal structure, with fractures, joints, and potentially significant voids that reflect the complex history of its formation and subsequent cooling. The connection between surface features in the south face and deeper features in the plug is not geologically implausible. The seismic data that exists for the Stirling area, generated by various survey programs over the last several decades, would in principle contain information about the deeper structure of the crag and about the character of any void spaces within it. The publicly accessible portions of the seismic data for the area do not provide a detailed picture of the crag's internal structure at the relevant scales. Whether the non-publicly accessible portions of the data contain more specific information is not determinable from outside the institutions that hold the data. The geological plausibility of a connected subsurface system beneath the Stirling crag is relevant to the question of what the sealed passages might contain. A connected system would imply that the passages are not isolated features, but are part of a larger structure, one that potentially includes significant void spaces at greater depth, and one that could, in principle, have been accessed and used in ways that a shallow, isolated cavity could not. The possibility of a connected subsurface system is consistent with the descriptions in the documentary record, which use language that implies more than a shallow chamber. The Georgian military surveyor's reference to a passage of substantial depth, and the descriptions in other sources of features that lead further inward. If the passages are part of a connected system, then the features that have been observed from the south face are only the entry points to a larger complex that the management tradition has been protecting from investigation. A larger, connected complex beneath the Stirling crag would be a geological phenomenon of extraordinary interest in its own right, quite apart from any human construction within or associated with it. The existence of a significant void system within the basalt plug and the adjacent sedimentary rock would be of geological significance for the understanding of the volcanic and post-volcanic history of the area. The geological significance would be a reason for investigation in its own right, independent of the question of what human activity may have been associated with the complex. The geological and archaeological questions about the Stirling underground are therefore not separable. The geological structure of the site is the context within which the human features are located, and the understanding of the geological structure is a prerequisite for understanding the human features. A comprehensive investigation of what is beneath Stirling would therefore need to integrate geological and archaeological approaches in a way that the standard division of scientific responsibility does not naturally produce. The integration of geological and archaeological investigation at significant sites is an approach that has been developed in other contexts. The investigation of the deep karst systems of Central America, for instance, has involved the close collaboration of speleologists, geologists, and archaeologists, with each discipline contributing knowledge that is essential for the interpretation of what the others find. A similar collaborative approach to the investigation of the Stirling underground would be the appropriate model, though the geological character of the Stirling site is different from the karst systems of Central America and would require adaptations of the methods used in those contexts. The Stirling basalt is harder and more resistant to dissolution than the limestone of karst systems. The void spaces in it are therefore not the product of the same dissolution processes that create cave systems in limestone. They are the product of cooling fractures, of the geological disruption created by the volcanic plug's intrusion into the surrounding rock, and potentially of other geological processes, whose exact nature is not publicly documented for the specific case of the Stirling crag. The hardness of the basalt is one of the reasons why the constructed features described in the documentary record are significant. It takes more effort to work hard basalt than to work softer sedimentary rock, and the presence of constructed features in or associated with the basalt of the Stirling plug implies a capability and an intention that goes beyond simple exploitation of available natural cavities. Someone made something in or near the hardest rock of the site and sealed it when they had finished. The making and the sealing required both capability and purpose, and the durability of both the construction and the sealing testifies to the seriousness of the purpose. The purpose is the ultimate unknown. What was the sealed passage system beneath the Stirling Crag for? The question is the one that the entire documentary record, across 2,000 years, has carefully avoided trying to answer. Every group that has encountered the features has noted them, responded to them, and moved on without attempting to characterize their purpose. The characterization of their purpose would require knowing what is in them, and knowing what is in them would require entering them, and the consistent management decision has been not to enter them. But the purposes that might explain features of the kind described in the documentary record can be considered in general terms, even without entering the passages. The sealed passages of the south face of a volcanic crag, at a site recognized as significant for ceremony and governance across many cultures and many periods, are consistent with a range of possible purposes. They could be storage. They could be ceremonial spaces whose significance was connected to the underground character of the site. They could be memorial spaces whose content was the reason for the sealing. They could be spaces associated with specific practices that required a protected and controlled environment, or they could be something that none of these familiar categories adequately captures. The possible purposes are interesting, but the most interesting thing about the sealed passages is not their possible purpose, but the decision that was made to seal them. Whatever was in them was worth sealing in. The sealing was deliberate and apparently effective because the passages are still sealed. And the effectiveness of the sealing, over the span of time that has elapsed since it was done, says something about both the quality of the construction and the nature of what was sealed. Things that are worth sealing carefully and maintaining sealed across very long periods are things that are worth knowing about. Whatever purpose the passages served, the decision to seal them was a considered one, made by people who understood what they were sealing and why the sealing was appropriate. The appropriateness of the sealing has been recognized by every group that has subsequently encountered the sealed passages. 2,000 years of recognition that the sealing was appropriate is a substantial validation of the original decision. The validation is not proof of anything specific about what is in the passages. It is proof that the original decision to seal them has been recognized as correct by a very long series of subsequent encounters with their sealed condition. The recognition might be based on knowledge of what is in them, transmitted through some channel that is not publicly documented, or it might be based on a more general recognition of the significance of the sealed condition itself, a recognition that something sealed so carefully and maintained so effectively must contain something that is worth the sealing. Either way, the weight of the recognition, accumulated across 2,000 years of consistent management, is the most substantial piece of evidence available that the contents of the sealed passages are significant. Not what is in them, but the fact that they have been consistently maintained and consistently respected is the evidence. And that evidence, while it does not answer the question of what is in them, establishes the importance of eventually answering that question. The importance of the question is not proportional to the drama of the answer. The answer might be extraordinary by the standards of what archaeological investigation usually finds, or it might be, when it is finally seen, something that is significant precisely because of its character rather than its drama, something that tells you about the deep past of this part of the world in a way that changes the picture without providing the kind of obvious visual spectacle that makes for compelling immediate impact. The deep past of the Scottish landscape is not primarily a landscape of visual spectacle. It is a landscape of endurance and continuity, of things that have been in place for very long periods and that have accumulated significance through that duration rather than through any single dramatic event. The sealed passages of the Stirling Crag, if they are consistent with that landscape, will tell a story of duration and significance that is less dramatic and more profound than the story of a single sensational discovery. That kind of story, of duration and significance, and the slow accumulation of meaning across very long periods, is the kind of story that the Stirling Crag as a whole tells. The crag has been here longer than any human presence in Scotland. It has been significant for the full span of human presence in Scotland, and what is beneath it has been sealed and recognised and left alone for the full span of the documented encounter with it. That is a long story. The full telling of it would require a different and more complete account than this one has been able to offer. What this account has offered is the partial picture that the available evidence allows: the shape of the pattern, the consistency of the management, the specificity of the location, and the accumulated weight of 2,000 years of recognition that what is there is significant enough to be left alone and maintained in the state in which it was found. The shape of the pattern is clear. The consistency is documented. The specificity is established. The weight is real. And what is beneath the south face of the Stirling Crag, sealed by someone a long time ago, maintained by a management tradition that has outlasted every other tradition in the site's history, is still there. Still sealed, still significant, still waiting. The Fourth Valley is ancient. The crag is older than the valley. The river is younger than both. The question of what is in the sealed passages of the south face is older than the question itself, older than the records that document the encounter with it, older than the management tradition that has maintained it. It is as old as the decision that was made to seal the passages, and that decision was made long enough ago that no surviving record documents it. What survives is the result of the decision. Sealed passages, recognized as significant by everyone who has encountered them, maintained in their sealed condition by the accumulated weight of decisions that have been made about them across the full span of Scottish history. What survives is the management tradition and the partial documentation it has generated. What survives is the shape of the pattern, pointing toward a specific location in the south face of the crag, describing a specific category of feature, recommending a specific approach that has been consistently followed. The recommendation has been followed for long enough. The question is ready to be asked. What is beneath Stirling is worth knowing. The sealed crag will wait as long as is needed for the knowing to come, but it will not wait forever, because nothing lasts forever, not even the decisions made about the most significant places in the most significant landscapes. The asking is coming, the answer is in the sealed passages, and when the asking and the answering finally meet, what has been maintained in the state in which it was found for longer than any other tradition in this landscape has endured will be seen, for the first time since someone shut the doors, in the light. Whatever that light reveals will have been worth everything it took to finally reach it. The crag stands over the valley, the river runs below, the old town sleeps on the hill, and somewhere in the south face of the volcanic rock, in the sealed passages behind the old doors, something patient and significant and old waits for the question that is gathering itself, slowly and across many years, to finally be asked. What is beneath Stirling? The answer is in there, sealed, waiting, still in the state in which it was found. The last thing to say about the Stirling Crag and what is beneath it is the thing that the available evidence most clearly establishes, and that is the simplest thing. Someone was there first. Someone, or something, was in the ground beneath the south face of the crag before the Romans arrived, before the Picts left their symbol stones, before Robert the Bruce fought at Bannockburn, before James VI was crowned in the Holy Rood, before the Jacobite garrison occupied the castle, before the Victorian drainage workers redirected their cut, before the early 21st century Heritage Survey found the anomalous features on the south side and recommended the specialized assessment that was never conducted. Someone was there first and made something and sealed it. The making and the sealing are the oldest documented facts about what is in the ground beneath Stirling. They are older than the documentation. They predate the records that describe them, and they have endured through everything that has happened in the Forth Valley and in Scotland and in the world since the decision to make and to seal was originally executed. The durability of the original decision is what the 2,000 years of consistent management attests to. The original decision was good enough, and the sealing was thorough enough, and the significance of what was sealed was serious enough, that every subsequent group of people who encountered the result of the decision responded to it with the same combination of recognition and respect that the original decision apparently warranted. That combination of recognition and respect is what the management tradition represents. Not a conspiracy to conceal, not a formal policy of suppression, a consistent pattern of recognition that something in the south face of the Stirling Crag was significant and sealed and worth maintaining in its sealed condition. The recognition was sometimes explicit, as in the Jacobite officer's letter and the post-Bannockburn administrative reference. It was sometimes implicit, expressed only through the practical decision to redirect the drainage cut or modify the development design. But in every case, Across every period and every institutional context, the recognition was there, and the decision it produced was the same decision. That decision, accumulated across 2,000 years of encounter, is the strongest available evidence that what is in the sealed passages of the south face is worth the sustained attention of the question that this account has been building toward. The Stirling crag features are ready to be addressed. The evidence that they exist and that they are significant is accumulated. The direction of change in the archaeological and heritage management frameworks is toward the kind of engagement with the genuinely unknown that addressing the features would require. And the time that has elapsed since the original sealing is, on the scale of the deep past that the features belong to, not so long that the original purpose and the original content of the sealed passages are necessarily beyond recovery. When that recovery happens, the picture of the deep past of Scotland and of the North Atlantic world that Scotland is part of will change. The change will be significant. The significance will have been earned by the long patience of the waiting and the long care of the management that has preserved what is there for the knowing. The geological record of the British Isles documents a landscape that has been shaped by forces operating over timescales that make all of human history look very recent. The volcanic activity that produced the Stirling plug was part of a period of geological change that reshaped the landscape of northern Britain and whose effects are still visible in the volcanic hills and crags that punctuate the otherwise glacially smooth terrain of the Central Belt. These features of the landscape are among the most ancient visible things in the British Isles, older than the mountain ranges of England and Wales, older than the chalk downs of southern England, older, in some cases, than the current configuration of the British Isles as an island. The ancientness of the geological features within which the human story of the Stirling site is embedded is one of the reasons why the human story feels incomplete without an account of what the geological context contains. The standard historical account of Stirling begins with the castle and works backward through the documented medieval and early modern periods, occasionally reaching into the prehistorical record of the Iron Age and earlier periods. But the geological context in which all of that history is set is not itself a part of the standard account. The crag is taken as given, as the stage on which the human drama plays out, not as a subject of inquiry in its own right. Taking the crag as a subject of inquiry, and asking what is in it and beneath it, and what the relationship between its geological character and the human history of the site has been, is the approach that this account has taken. The approach reveals a picture that the standard historical account does not provide. A picture of a site whose underground character has been recognized as significant by every group that has used it, and that has been managed consistently across the full span of documented history in ways that have kept whatever is in the ground in the same sealed condition that the original decision established. The picture is the evidence for what this account has argued, that there is something significant beneath Stirling, that the significance has been consistently recognized, and that the consistent recognition has produced a consistent management response. The management response has preserved whatever is there for longer than most things in the human world are preserved. And that preservation, however long it continues, is a form of patient waiting for the moment when the question of what is there is finally ready to be asked, and the tools for answering it are finally adequate. The moment is approaching. The tools are improving. The frameworks are developing. And the sealed passages of the south face of the Stirling crag, patient in the rock above the Forth Valley, will be there when the moment arrives. The crag stands. The passages are sealed. The question is ready. And one day, the knowing will come, still sealed, still in the state in which they were found, still waiting for the light that finally illum. The south face of the Stirling crag has faced the Forth Valley since before the valley had its current shape. It has faced the river since before the river had its current course. It has faced the people who have moved through the valley since before the first people arrived to move through it. The features within the crag, sealed and significant and maintained with the care that the management tradition has provided across 2,000 years of documented history, have been there through all of that. They will be there for as long as the basalt endures, and the basalt endures on the scale of geological time, which makes whatever span of time remains before the question is finally answered a small thing in the history of the features themselves. The features are patient. The question is building. The answer is waiting. And what is beneath Stirling in the end is the thing that has always been there, The sealed thing, the old thing, the significant thing, waiting behind the doors that someone closed a long time ago, in the dark beneath the volcanic rock that has stood over the Fourth Valley since before the question could be asked. What is beneath Stirling? Still there, still sealed, still waiting for the day when the light comes and the knowing finally begins.